listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And you're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, coming to you live from the divided states of America. In the politically independent corner, I am investigative radio show host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas. Together,
we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I've got to say, man, I just want to come back to this. Burning ember in the darkness is a great mental image to have. That is a great mental hook to have. It's a resilient, it's fiery, it has potential. I'm just pointing that out. Anyway.
I appreciate that. There's a poem with a guy making the point that I don't want to die out, kind of like it's a blip. I want to go out as a burning ember. I love the imagery of it, so that's what I go with.
It's a good one. No, that's good. It has that sort of primal, yeah. All right, so here's what we do. At 7, 8, and 9 a.m. every morning, we do headlines. That's Eastern, 4, 5, and 6 a.m. Pacific. This first time after we do headlines, Jamarl does a short monologue. Then we're taking calls at 7:15. Again, 7:15 Eastern, 202-521-1320 is the number you can call to call us. But first, the headlines. Big headline today, Russia is claiming a coronavirus vaccination victory, with President Vladimir Putin saying that one of his own daughters has already been inoculated with the coronavirus vaccine and has recovered, only seeing a slight boost in temperature after she received each of 2 shots. The vaccine has not yet seen widespread use or phase 3 testing, although the Russian Federation is currently undergoing more testing and planning a production ramp up in September, and has said that the mass vaccination may begin as early as October. Last month, the U.S., Britain, and Canada accused Russia of using hackers to steal vaccine research from Western labs. That's the end of the headline I have written up. I'm just going to point out, if Russia stole the vaccine research from these big Western countries and then developed it faster than them, it just doesn't seem plausible to me. I'm just pointing out the inherent contradiction there. Assuming this works, assuming this pans out, I mean, I don't know. There's so many years of just random anonymous accusations of hacking, not to mention other crimes, that it's all kind of worn out. But yeah, pointing out here that Russia, if this pans out, if this vaccine works, and I'd hope so, considering, again, Putin gave his daughter a dose of it, 2 doses of it from what I hear, then yeah, that's a big thing. We've talked about this off air, the sort of prestige race, as crude as it may seem, but this prestige race, almost like a space race between nations, between countries trying to develop a vaccine, trying to develop some way out of this crisis. If Russia does this, like they did with the space race, jumping first. We'll see where that actually goes. Anyway, interesting big story, hoping that pans out for the world's sake. Second headline this morning, a shooting near the White House yesterday afternoon led the Secret Service to escort Trump out of a press briefing after a 21-year-old suspect near 17th and Pennsylvania told a Secret Service agent that he was armed before charging President and everyone else in the vicinity, other than the 21-year-old suspect. They seem okay. Just pointing that out. Over in Seattle's police chief, Carmen Best, is expected to announce her retirement. This comes after the local city council voted to reduce the department by approximately 100 officers through layoffs and attrition, and to cut the $4 million off of the department's $400 million budget, so about a 1% budget reduction there. Trump is getting pushback from state governors on the cost of paying for his executive order relief programs. Specifically, Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York, basically saying that this aid is equivalent to handing a drowning man an anchor. The idea here is the cost is so darn high. The orders there in New York are, he's saying, set to cost his state up to $4 billion through the end of 2020. That's the state's paying the $100 employee unemployment match, basically, out of the $400 a week. States are expected to pay 25% or $100. He's saying that cost alone could cost his state up to $4 billion, again, through the end of 2020. Meanwhile, California Governor Gavin Newsom said that's a bit more than $400 billion, depending on exactly when the implementation begins. Presidential primary day today in Connecticut has been rescheduled twice in the past due to the coronavirus, but it is taking place today. Registered voters are allowed to vote absentee because of the virus, and the state says that 300,000 voters have filled out applications for their ballots. There have been concerns about ballots getting to voters on time, although officials now say that nearly all ballots have been received by voters in time for today's election. Connecticut is one of the states hit especially hard by COVID-19, with over 50,000 confirmed cases and over 4,441 deaths attributed to the coronavirus right now. Meanwhile, Hawaii is setting turnout records in its first all-mail-in primary and also setting the record for the number of votes cast in a primary election with 300,152. That's a new record for them, again, apparently because of the all-mail-in aspect here. Honolulu voters also set an Oahu record for votes cast in a primary election. That record is 256,344. The previous Honolulu record for a primary election was recorded in 1994 with 225,406 votes. That's about what is that? Almost 30,000 more, a little bit over 30,000 more. Interesting. Last night, Judge Peter Cahill in the George Floyd case released police body cam footage from 2 Minneapolis police involved in the death of George Floyd. The footage, roughly an hour in length, comes from the body cameras of former officers Thomas Lane and J. Alexander Kyung. Go check it out if you're trying to get deeper into that story, or you're trying to sort of get to the bottom of that. It's a little bit over an hour long. The next story: a majority of voters, including half of Democrats, think that 77-year-old presidential candidate and former Vice President Joe Biden won't serve all 4 years as president if elected. I just think this is crazy, Jamarl. Again, I'm just going to restate this. A majority of voters, including half of Democrats, think that 77-year-old presidential candidate and former Vice President Joe Biden won't serve all 4 years as president if he's elected. What this reminds me of was back in 2016 when everybody was looking at Bernie's age and using age as a disqualifier. And now 49%, about half of Democrats, I'll say that again, think that Joe Biden won't serve all 4 years as president if elected. That's just sad. Anyway, got to get through the headlines. Next one here. The number of people flying in commercial airlines is going up at this point in the pandemic, although passenger travel remains far below where it was last year. More than 830,000 people went through TSA checkpoints. That's the most since March 17th. That's for this last Sunday. Although it's 70% fewer than the 2.5 million registered on the same Sunday last August. So people are traveling again, although again, the travel industry has been hit pretty hard. And in our last story this morning, a Northwest Baltimore gas explosion leveled 3 row houses Monday morning, killing 1 person and leaving 7 others injured. The Baltimore Gas and Electric Company said in a statement that no gas readings were found in any of the buildings and no leaks were found on the gas main. They're trying to figure out exactly what was going on there. The fire department is still conducting a search for survivors. You are all caught up. That's the news. Those are the top headlines. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Jamarl, what is your top priority today?
The top priority today, before I do anything else, is to wish my co-host a happy birthday. A very, very happy birthday. Shane Stranahan, my co-host, it's his birthday today. And I wish for everybody right now to sing Shane happy birthday to yourselves, wherever you are, in your offices or on your way to work. And I will do
Thank you.
a semblance really here. Happy birthday to my co-host, Shane Stranahan. Happy birthday. No, man. In all seriousness, happy birthday, man. And I hope this year goes extraordinarily well, especially with the new show and everything else. So far, we've done exceedingly well. I have no idea or no reason why that would necessarily continue. So this is my wish for my family. Hollingsworth upstairs, I'm pretty sure she's putting it in the chat. Happy birthday.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Jamarl. And thank you, anybody out there. Thank you. Turning 28 today. Interesting day. Just hanging out with my aunt at home. You know, eating a little bit of cake. Under normal
circumstances, we'd be out to a bar or something. But we just have to put that on the back burner for when we finally get the opportunity to get back into the office. We can get hammered or stoned or whatever.
That'd be awesome. No, that'd be great.
Both of those are legal in DC and Maryland.
And
all right, so let's.
Yeah, totally. No, go for it.
And whenever you're back in town, so there's that. I was conflicted on where to start my stories today. Part of them was the Putin thing, the announcement that Russia has finished their vaccine and what it means in the context of a world where America is supposedly a superpower that can spend $1 trillion on military, but apparently can't finish the vaccine first. I was going to go into the 97,000 kids that have been diagnosed with COVID over a 2-week period, or for that matter, the school that those pictures came out showing those kids in Georgia where they punished the kid that came out with the picture, only to find that there were multiple people in the picture that had the virus. Eventually, they let him out. But that's a great lesson for him to understand when he gets older, that whether you're right in the context of what's best for the public is secondary than what the power or what the accrual of power has determined. And in that case, what you did showing, yeah, this looks bad, was correct. The power center that was disposed of concerning and dealing with those kids and making sure those kids were safe. They did not like the fact that that image was shown and was willing to punish you for doing the right thing. That is a lesson, larger lessons for life. That is kind of the way it often goes. I think, though, the thing that I want to nail down is the sad state of political affairs that would create an organization called Settle for Biden. Now, think about what that means. That back in 2008, you had aspirational politics. Obama screaming hope and change. Even if it didn't necessarily mean anything in any real terms, it felt good. It made people have this idea of something in their heads about what hope and change meant in their political space. And even though those people were conned and scammed, and even though those people in 2016 felt that they didn't receive this hope and change, whatever that hope and change meant, and decided to vote for Trump, I think it was like 20% of Obama voters. Those people, at the very least, had an aspirational argument to get in office. For Joe Biden, the vice president of that guy with that aspirational argument, screaming hope and change at every place, political post from across the United States, his vice president has accepted a faction of people trying to get him in office, making the argument, settle for Biden. Put away your childish wants of a better world. You want Medicare for all with 88% support? Bah! Go vote for the other guy. Unless you're willing to settle for Joe Biden. You want free college and university and ensure that all college debt is eliminated? Bah! Vote for the other guy. Because what Joe Biden knows is that he is the greatest distillation of you have nowhere else to go that has ever been created in a political space. And he wallows in it. When he tells the public, look, nothing is going to fundamentally change. A room full of oligarchs. Nothing is going to fundamentally change for you in my administration. He means that. He's being honest with him. What that also means, though, is nothing going to fundamentally change for you either. Despite the fact, think of your world before all of the COVID-19 stuff hit. Trump didn't drag the world off of a cliff. You were already falling off of a cliff. What you're deeming as a certain degree of relative momentum between either an Obama or a Clinton or, in this case, a Joe Biden and a Trump. You were already falling off the cliff. I know you don't think so. I know it looks worse under Trump, but that's just because he pulled the mask off. He didn't have the gravitas. He didn't have the ability to give you this kind of sparkle and shine of the office. He was incompetent. And as such, this is the world that you get. But even when people were competent, this was still the world that you got. There were certain incentives that were built into our political process that allowed your political party to run as fast and as far to the right. Is there anything objective of you when you're looking at your politics that is not relative? Meaning your Democratic politics has basically become anything that's relative to the Republican Party, which basically is what settle for Joe Biden means. Is there anything objective that is you? Do you believe in Social Security so fervently that you're not willing to vote for a Democrat if they're willing to throw it up in flames? Do you believe in Medicare for all so fervently that you're not willing to vote for the Democrat if it goes up in flames? Are you willing to believe in Medicare for all or Medicare so fervently? I'm making the point. Is there anything that is of you that is so objectively true in the way that you look at the world that you won't be willing to settle and accept a party if they're willing to betray those things? And if there is not, then there is no, it's always entirely relative. That you are basically Republican minus X, as opposed to being something indistinct or distinct in and of itself. Settle for Biden is one of the saddest political depictions that I've ever seen, and possibly one of the most honest, because that is basically what they're asking you to do. Settle, as opposed to stand outside of the political space and push for the party, for the policies that you want and expect. Let's go to a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik. Tune in Tuesdays to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for Women in Society with Professor Hannah Dickinson, where we talk about the major issues, challenges, and struggles facing women in all aspects of society. Hannah Dickinson, professor and organizer with the Geneva Women's Assembly, joins the show this Tuesday and every Tuesday on Loud and Clear.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are taking calls. This segment, 202-521-1320 is the number. Again, 202-521-1320. We're speaking with Maram Susli this next segment, partisan girl or Syrian girl, she is sometimes known as also. We're talking with her about the Beirut blast, the explosion in apparently a fireworks warehouse triggered by ammonium nitrate next door. Anyway, we're going to be talking about that, if there was something else that potentially caused that blast, and just the weird series of events that have been leading up to that in terms of skirmishes between Israel and Lebanon, specifically Hezbollah. We'll be getting back into that. But again, we're taking calls this segment, 202-521-1320. Jamarl, I want to come back to what you were talking about there for a second. We were talking about this with Chris Hedges in a pre-recorded interview we did last night, in the afternoon, I guess. And I'll probably be playing that tomorrow. But what came up for me, one of the things that got brought back up just by hearing what you were saying, is this idea of how horrible of a candidate Joe Biden is. Especially when you put him next to Trump, as Trump is a sort of bogeyman for the Democrats over the last 4 years, and then they put up the weakest, most abysmal possible candidate. It's this weird, it's this weird asymmetry where, as far as I can tell, what's protecting Biden from Trump in this case, other than Trump's own, failures, and long-term embattlement and stuff, is just how meek Biden is, and how he's basically not coming out, not talking, not doing anything. His strategy here is basically to hide, and I really think anybody would be better. A magic 8-ball would be better. A magic 8-ball would actually be black. It would actually give answers within a reasonable period of time. It seems like Biden will just dilly-dally. Literally anything would be better. And that's the weird contradiction. I don't know,
strategy.
Man.
If you were a boxer and you were trying to win, if you were a boxer and you were trying to win a match, and the only thing you cared about is winning the match, you didn't care about giving the audience a good match, you didn't care about the technique, you didn't care about none of that stuff. Your objective is, I want to win. And I can't beat this guy in a match where we're just going to stand out here and fight. So what I'm going to do is, for the entirety of the match, I'm going to hug him. Now, the audience is going to boo. The audience is going to be angry. The ref is going to be getting annoyed with me. I don't care. I'm going to hug this guy, because otherwise he's going to punch me in the face over and over and over and over again. Joe Biden is taking the most optimal course to win a match. If you and I were playing chess, you may get annoyed at me for taking actions that try to mitigate whatever your best strengths are. But that is kind of part of the contest. It's just aggravating, because politics goes beyond just this normal gameplay. It goes into you being able to make a case to your public to give them what is in their best interest, or at the very least, what they are screaming for. And right now, we don't have that. I mean, we have Trump, who is the opposite of what the public wants and what the public needs. And you have Joe Biden, who is every bit as much. But he would argue, I'm least worse. That's basically what Settle for Biden is. I'm least worse. So don't expect the things that you want. 88% Medicare for all. The overwhelming majority of the public saying, yes, we want to get rid of student debt, or we want a wealth tax, or whatever these things are. Whether you for them or not. I'm just saying, within the context of the party that is called Democratic Party, no less, where your countrymen say we want X and Y to deal with the emergencies of our day. And you have Biden, who basically tells those people to kick rocks, and then will secondly say, go vote for Trump.
I just want to focus on this part for a second too. I mean, literally, I've been kind of scraping my brain and looking around and doing some research. Has there ever been a worse presidential candidate among the two primary parties in the United States history, in the entire history of the United States, compared to
wow.
Biden? And I'm not kidding. I mean, half
I
of
don't
half
know.
of the people who are planning on voting for him, as far as I can tell, 49% of Democrats think he won't live his first term. He's widely believed to be suffering serious cognitive degeneration. Just those two facts alone, on a sort of physical basis, isn't who is worse in American history, literally. And if there is nobody worse, then that means that we're in a completely moreless situation. There's no comparison for it.
I don't think there is a
Do you see where
comparison
I'm
for it.
going?
Yeah, at least not. Look, in my mind, I don't think there's a comparison for it. I mean, look, when you had Clinton versus Trump, people were like, oh, this is the worst case ever. This is the worst case ever. And whatever you want to think of Clinton, at the very least, she had the capacity of standing there and talking. Even if she wasn't saying anything, she could stand there and talk. Joe Biden can't even really do that. I mean, they're basically arguing that the guy is not going to exceed his term. They don't have a great expectation that he's going to make it through his 4 years. And the people were still like, well, hey, we prefer him over Sanders. And so let's throw all of our support behind the guy who doesn't have the great ideas to deal with this particular moment in time, that is not capable physically of even standing up for the job itself, and who the overwhelming majority are saying they're voting for, not because of who he is, but entirely because of who he's not. And this is where our politics are. That's appalling. Like, greatest democracy on the planet with two candidates for the last two presidential terms that the American public basically didn't like. That's appalling.
Yeah,
It just is.
that's it's another side of this is in the from the grand ideological perspective. This is happening amidst a sort of larger scale crisis in the fate of democracy versus authoritarianism or whatever, however you want to set up that dichotomy. But going into 2014, 2015, 2016, this wave of sort of resurgent, what you might see as nationalism, probably pretty appropriately, not like ethnic nationalism, obviously, but the sort of soft, small n nationalism that everybody sort of tacitly accepts as a competitor to big international corporatism and international global alliances. Anyway, you see that resurgence, and with it, you see a crisis in the fate, apparently, of democracy as such, where a lot of people were sort of, literally, democracy dies in darkness, the Washington Post slogan. It's a big thing. So a lot of people are pinning that on Trump. But then again, look at the quality of the candidate set against Trump. Isn't that just as much an indictment of democracy? And I'm not getting there. I mean, if each of these were figures that were elevated successfully through the American political system, and if, to me, Biden seems more dire than Trump, and he probably wouldn't have a few years ago because he seemed to be doing much better since then. It really is the cognitive degeneration thing. I mean, the establishment stuff aside, that's enough grounds for criticism from me, but it should be enough grounds for criticism for anybody that he's going through all of this stuff. He doesn't seem like he's going to live very long. He doesn't seem like he can make cogent, well thought out decisions on a long-term basis. Again, from this larger perspective, what does that mean in terms of that ideology? Literally, if we were the country that was paramount in importance in setting the standard for what democracy would look like, how the hell is democracy going to look in the 21st century with that standard set in place? Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, to be fair, I think it's an indictment of democracy being waterboarded by capitalism. If we're being honest. I mean, because we're not a democracy. We're a representative government at best. And it's a representative government where you have advertisements, you have companies that have certain ideas that they want politically and can invest ungodly sums of money to make those ideas come to life. We have politicians who know where their bread is buttered. 90% of the races are won by the side with the most cash. Like, if we were talking about something that was like a democracy, or even a representative government that wasn't being ensconced with this kind of cash flowing all around, I think you may get different outcomes. Like, with 88% supporting Medicare for all, does the Democratic Party blow that off if money wasn't the main guidance for it? Again, whether you agree with it or not, you could be that 12% of Democrats that don't agree with it. I'm actually something slightly different. If you have a party where you have all of these people who agree with a policy to such an extent, whatever the policy is, call it a wealth tax, call it a jobs guarantee, call it a Green New Deal, whatever that policy is, will the party be so willing and able to basically tell you to kick rocks if their bread wasn't being buttered by somebody else with great, godly, wealth-wise means? I think it would be different. I don't think you get that other pull or that other thing. You have dollars or pitchforks. What happens when you get rid of the dollars? Well, you just have pitchforks, right? And then maybe there's some other leverage that gets pulled in order to try to influence and pull the politicians. But I do think it's a failure of democracy when democracy pretends as if, or representative government pretends as if there's nothing interceding it. And in this very specific case, there is something interceding it. That congressman needs cash to pay his bills. That congressman wants a better life for his kids. So he wants to get that kid in the best position that the kid could get in for that kid's life. That congressman wants to get elected next year. What does that guy do in order to get those things accomplished? And that would mean that his responsibilities and the things that are affecting him go beyond just the office. It goes into what he needs to do as a human being to make his life great in an economic way. I agree with you. I agree that there's an indictment here, but I don't think the indictment is of democracy in and of itself, or even a representative government in and of itself. I think it's a combination of those things. What do you think? I mean, we do have callers, but what do you think?
Yeah,
first?
we should go to callers. This will become a whirlpool, and I'll chase you down it, and then we'll lose our time to take calls. So we shouldn't do that.
Fair enough.
Adam in Colorado. Let's go to Adam real quick. We've got Lynn in Little Rock after Adam. But Adam, you're on. What's going on?
Okay. Well, one thing that to put the whole thing in context. By the way, happy birthday.
Hey, thank you.
Is in 1929, when we had a similar crisis of our economy, it actually took 4 years before we came to FDR. It happened under Hoover that we had the crash in the first year of his term that year. And it took it getting progressively worse before we got better. The reason is the pain of the public has to reach a point, and at that point, they will actually exert external force. Now, there's always the question, do we actually have the ability to mobilize people like they did back then? After all, we don't have the socialist groups, the communist groups, the unions that we did at the time. But what we have shown just in the protests as of late is that once the pain hits a specific point, even if it is guided towards a specific outcome, the people will activate. So the question isn't whether the people will find themselves moving towards something. It's a question of whether or not they will be sheepdogged into certain modes of action.
Adam, thank you for the call. I think something else that really matters here is not just movement or not just the mechanics of it, but it's this sort of on the level of what we can see and what we think is important, making sure that goes well, making sure that the values are right, making sure that the culture is right, making sure the goals are right, doing all that stuff. I mean, you can only do that for yourself if you don't have an organization or if you haven't started organizing yet. But once you do, assuming you want to try to make that larger change, then I think that becomes especially important. Anyway, just I think that you're right about that last part about if you get inside it, if there's a potential, then people will act along that and it will express itself. But let's go to Lynn in Little Rock. Lynn, you're on the line. What's going on?
I tell you, one reason why we're stuck with people like Trump and Biden and all these players that are basically mafia people, it's because journalism is dead. Journalism is mostly written by a bunch of cowards that cow down to people like Trump and Biden. They don't report facts. I mean, they're bought and paid for. They're run by all these lobbyists, deep state people. They don't report facts. They don't report truth. They don't get down to the nitty-gritty of what's actually going on in this world and report true information. And that's why we get stuck with people like Trump and Biden, who are basically mafia people. And until this journalism actually starts talking about the real nitty-gritty stuff that's going on in this world and quit, letting Trump and Biden and all these other hooligans get by with what they're doing, we will never have a good world. Until, the people start demanding it, then we're going to be stuck with these fraudsters. So, I don't ever see anything happening and getting right until we get some good journalism who actually bring these people to their reckoning for what they're doing to our country.
Lynn, thank you for the call. I agree wholeheartedly with you. Journalism is incredibly important when it's done well, especially it has the chance to break apart power. Otherwise, it tends to serve the interests of it. I think that's actually the definition of good journalism. Otherwise, it's just propaganda. In any event, we're going to be back in a minute. We're talking with Maram Sousli, a good journalist herself. We're going to be joined by her talking about the Beirut blast, the history there, potentially some events that led up to this, assuming this may have been that there's a chance that this was an attack. Again, back in just a minute with Maram Sousli. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
It's time to double down with Max and Stacy.
Yeah, double down. We're talking markets, finance, business, economics, ka-ching, bling, just about everything money related on Sputnik. It's called Double Down.
We're asking, are dead cats bouncing or have fundamentals changed? That's this week on Double Down.
We are talking.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, birthday man, Shane Stranahan. We're coming from a station out of Washington, D.C. If you're there, you can listen to us on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Currently, though, joining us is Maram Sousli, political commentator and geopolitical analyst. You can find her on social media, on Facebook and Twitter at Partisan Girl. Maram, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
Absolutely. So the events in Beirut. Now, when this initially happened, I think one of the weirdest and oddest things, before anybody really understood what was going on, was Donald Trump came out and made some assertion that this was some kind of attack. I think many people took this kind of with a grain of salt because it's Trump. By the same token, if I am not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, Lebanon was querying Trump to figure out what he was using to come to that particular assessment. Was there any information that Donald Trump knew that many other people involved didn't necessarily know? But as events went on, they've said it was ammonium nitrate and that it was in a harbor. Now, some people have made the point that just because it was something that might have been in the harbor doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't necessarily an attack. And the entire point of the investigation was to get down to the bottom of how did this get caused? What was the ensuing factors that led up to this particular event? People died. There were many people that were injured. You've had another situation where certain businesses were outright destroyed, and places of living situations were destroyed. And so a lot of people absolutely want to get down to the bottom of what caused this. Now, you've taken an interesting point of view, because your point of view has been we should not ignore the events that led up to the blast if we're trying to get a context on the blast in and of itself. And you can't separate those things. Did I explain any of that wrong? And could you add additional context that's necessary for people to understand what was going on and what is going on currently in Lebanon following the blast?
Thank you. That's a very accurate intro. I will get into the specifics of it, but you nailed it basically. I immediately, having seen what was going on a month prior, following the events in Iran, in Syria, and in Iraq, I immediately suspected that Israel was responsible. And the thing is that, as analysts, we are allowed to speculate In fact, analysts were speculating about the cause of the explosions on a port, with boats and everything, same as the Beirut port, but that port was in Iran. And these Washington, D.C. based analysts last month were saying that these mysterious explosions that were going on in the port in Iran were likely Israel was behind them. And yet here we have a mysterious explosion in Beirut, which, apparently we're not allowed to speculate on. We're not allowed to say it was Israel or anything like that. Now, the official sources, we have Lebanon saying they're going to investigate. We have denials from the Israelis. But what we need to understand is in Iran, over the last month, there have been several incidents of sabotage. Some of them were actually against the nuclear facility there, or a building outside of it. Ports, hospitals, there was a lot of mysterious explosions and fires. And again, these think tanks, these Washington, D.C. based think tanks, were saying that Israel was likely responsible. And in fact, Israel didn't deny it. So you have then Trump, as you said, he spoke with his generals, and they said that from what they could tell, from what they could see, it looked like by the way that the bomb loaded, or the strength of the explosion, which was apparently measured to be about 2.2, some people are saying 3 kilotons, they believe it was an attack. Now, the thing about Trump, the beautiful thing about Trump, is that he hears it and he regurgitates it. He doesn't really have a filter sometimes. So we actually might, from him, glean information that is not necessarily meant for public consumption. So then you got the generals and the military, issuing all these denials, but it doesn't really matter. He heard it, so he said it. So we have to take that as a piece of evidence. The thing is, all of our evidence is going to be circumstantial, because whatever evidence there is of sabotage, it's probably already exploded. And if you see there's videos of missiles or anything like that, they're fake. There's no videos of any missiles. And it doesn't have to be missiles. I mean, yes, there was fireworks at that port. Yes, there was ammonium nitrate at that port. But those things were there for 6 years, and there was never any incident. So sabotage is still possible in spite of those things being there. And it's not the only place that has ammonium nitrate. I mean, here in Australia, there's a place in New South Wales, close to a major city called Newcastle, which has 4 times the amount of ammonium nitrate stored than Beirut, and it's very close to the center of the city. So we also have to consider the timing, that this came just before the Rafiq Hariri tribunal results. So there's also 100 things I could tell you about that interestingly timed with this incident.
Well, what would be those things? I mean, for instance, I was reading through a document that you put out, and you basically was going down the list of the events that were taking place. It's like, I have a hard time seeing this, but let's see, Beirut, Israel. And that was the other interesting thing. Israel came out with a statement on this. Usually Israel doesn't come out with a statement on any of those attacks. They don't, accept or deny responsibility one way or the other, despite the fact that everybody knows that they were involved in a lot of these things. But from your standpoint, Israel bombs Gaza. You have Netanyahu threatens Hezbollah. Can you explain what was leading up, meaning to this blast in regards to the conflict between Israel and Lebanon? I thought that was so strange that Israel came out with this statement, basically solidarity with the people who they were just bombing. Can you explain the conflict that was going on between these two groups leading up to this?
Yes, absolutely. So a week prior, Israel was actually shelling Lebanon. So it's, as you said, it's strange that suddenly they would come out in solidarity with people that they were just bombing. And the day prior, like hours prior, they were actually shelling the Syrian military inside the Golan Heights. In fact, it was an intelligence gathering post of the Syrian military that they attacked. And there are sources from Syrian intelligence that say that before the Beirut blast, they got a lot of communication signals coming from the Israelis and some suspicious activity around the port. So all these things were happening just days before this attack. And in spite of the fact that the Israelis, usually you're right, they neither confirm nor deny, they play quite coy about it, but now they've denied it. I think the reason for that is it's very bad optics. A lot of civilians were hit, and in particular, Lebanese society is very fragmented. You have some segments of Lebanese, probably the future movement from the civil war that is actually against Hezbollah and for Israel. And in particular, the Israelis don't want to basically turn those people against them. And that's why they would deny this. They would deny this. It looks bad on them, especially the number of civilians that were injured or killed, even though they have no problem saying it for Palestinians. But for some reason, Palestinian lives just don't have as much currency in the world opinion as compared to the lives of Lebanese people, for example, probably because of the future movement and the possibility that they might make an alliance with Israel. That's unfortunately it at the end of the day. The other thing is that it's, as I said, there was sabotage in Iran leading up to it. And not only that, the Israelis, whilst they may officially have denied the attack, you had the leader of the Zahut party, Moshe Feilen, I'm sure I butchered his name, saying that the explosion gave him a great joy to watch and that it came on the same day of Israeli Valentine's Day as a gift from God. Then you have, the day prior, the Israelis announcing that they're going to hit urban targets in Lebanon in the next war with Hezbollah. You have the Israeli media. This is something that Pepe Escobar wrote in his article as well. The Israeli media is immediately linking the attack in the explosion in Beirut to Hezbollah, even though Hezbollah didn't own the fireworks or anything like that. They're immediately calling it a threat to Hezbollah. And in fact, I actually discussed this with one of these Washington think tank researchers that wrote an article saying Iran is going to face a summer of sabotage by Israel. And I said, well, was this part of your prediction? And her claim is, no, it wasn't, because it's because of the too many civilians or something along those lines. It doesn't really make sense. But clearly, there was stuff going on behind the scenes. At the end of the day, we also have to remember that Lebanon was facing new sanctions by the United States. This came just like while the Lebanese economy is completely collapsing. So add on top of that a 1/5 of a nuclear bomb that takes out the economy, that destroys a port, that is caused them to sign on to new IMF debt. It's basically the point of all of this, at the end of the day, is to try to destabilize Lebanon in order to get rid of Hezbollah and Iranian and Syrian influence. That is Israel's number one priority, and it's nothing they haven't done before. Sabotage is what they do, and this is just really right up their alley. The timing is everything as well with the Rafiq Hariri tribunal.
Maram, we have to go to a break in a minute, but real quick before we go, I just want to ask this: France, do you think there's any chance with France's former relationship with Syria? Apparently, at least a nominally friendly relationship to this point, where they were providing aid in the wake of the explosion. Do you think there's any chance that France would back Lebanon if they were to pursue this, if they were to investigate it and find any evidence of Israeli sabotage here?
No, the French would never back Lebanon if they went against Israel. Absolutely not. France, part of NATO, they are completely allied with Israel. So they would withdraw their aid if the results came to that. So definitely, the result of any investigation is not going to blame Israel. You can be sure of that.
That fits the description. All right, that is the voice of Maram Sousli. We will be back with her in just a minute. Again, great guest, Maram Sousli, geopolitical analyst. You can find her on Twitter at Partisan Girl, PARTISAN Girl. We'll be back with her in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
And we are back with Maram Sousli, political commentator and Geopolitical analyst. Real quick, you can follow Maram on Facebook and Twitter at Partisan Girl. She's on Twitter at Partisan Girl. You can also find her on YouTube by searching for Syrian Girl Partisan. Maram, thanks again for being with us. We're talking about the attack in Beirut, currently billed largely, and I'm still pretty on the fence, honestly, Maram. I've been leaning towards it being a natural thing. I've heard one of the weirdest things, and I'll start like this. One of the weirdest things that I saw soon after the announcement of the blast, when the news was coming out, was Israel denying it, which is just like you know what I mean. It's in itself a slight bit of evidence to see them denying it so soon after. And again, there had been the attacks back and forth between Hezbollah and Israel, effectively between Israel and Lebanon, realistically. In recent days. So there's totally that history. And we were talking about this, I believe, with Laith Marouf yesterday, about the history of, like you were talking about, sabotage apparently on Iran, where a number of sites, like you were describing, but everything from ports to nuclear facilities, just a wide variety of different fairly important infrastructural facilities were apparently attacked in this series of sort of weird catastrophes with explosions and fires and just random stuff happening. So I've been following that. With my hesitancy with this is I just don't want to jump the gun and assume something or say something when I don't know it's true. And with that in mind, what would you look for in terms of sort of more conclusive, or if you were the investigator on this and you were appointed not necessarily to make a certain case, but just to investigate it and try to figure out what's true, what else would you be looking for? Again, you're a chemist, so you actually do have, in a weird way, some of the background necessary for going into this stuff, but also just as as somebody who thinks pretty deeply about these things, I'm curious, where would you go, and what else? Because I don't want to sort of assume that you're wrong or undercut you in any way. What else maybe have you talked about that would make the case more for that being Israel?
Sure, absolutely. So what we had, the circumstantial evidence of events surrounding it, the timing of the Rafik Hariri tribunal. We had intelligence from Trump's generals and from the Syrian intelligence as well. And finally, as a chemist, I could talk about the fact that the amount of ammonium nitrate that was stored inside that facility, apparently 2,700 tons, it was measured that the equivalent TNT equivalent is 0.4 kilotons, and yet the measurements for the blast was 2.2 kilotons. So basically, the amount of ammonium nitrate there shouldn't have produced a blast as big as the one that we saw. And that, to me, this is according to MIT guys in MIT who did the calculations for the blast radius, the strength, the kilotons of the blast, and chemists that did the TNT equivalency for the ammonium nitrate, which I looked at, I checked, and I agree with. For the physics of the blast, I mean, I can't. That's up to the MIT engineers. But for the chemistry, I checked it myself, and that it should have been 0.4 kilotons, and it ended up being 2.2 or sometimes 3, according to some measurements. So I wonder what would basically account for that discrepancy. I haven't found a reason for that. The thing is that the ammonium nitrate is an accelerant. So whatever explosives there are, it's going to accelerate the reaction because it provides oxygen. So when the explosion happens and the ammonium nitrate reacts, basically it produces a lot of oxygen that will fuel a fire. So whatever there was, if there was explosives planted there, it would have basically made them more powerful. And fireworks is definitely not enough. So I suspect there was something like that. There was some kind of explosive other than the ammonium nitrate and other than the fireworks that would account for that discrepancy in the size of the blast.
Okay,
But you're not saying, just so we're clear, you're not saying that Israel is guilty. You're more so putting out that any investigation has to take into account that it could be foreign actors and not necessarily an accident.
Well, here's the thing. I know that some people are nervous about making claims that they can't absolutely prove, and certainly I cannot prove this. But this is my assessment as an analyst. So analysts were allowed to speculate, we're allowed to predict. Last time I was on your show, guys, it was, I think, Stranahan's dad. I discussed whether or not I believed the Iranians would retaliate for the strikes against Soleimani. And I said, they're 100% going to retaliate, and they're going to retaliate against military targets. Did I have evidence for that? No, but that was just my analysis. And it turned out to be correct. And afterwards, my analysis was that the U.S. was not going to retaliate. Had no evidence for that either, but that was my analysis. And I guess it's the realm of the brave to get out there and say what they believe. And just from my assessment, my gathering of the circumstantial evidence, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it was Israel. I'm not going to say that I'm waiting for the official source or any investigation. Prove me wrong, by all means. But at this point, right now, I'm going to make a stand and say it was Israel.
Oh yeah, totally. No, that's I'm
Fair
happy.
enough.
I'm happy having a conversation with that kind of thing, because I'm like that with a lot of different stuff myself. That's just I feel like that's just, if we're honest with ourselves, that's how we are in different things. And I think ideally, and you're pretty good about this, is just continuing to inform yourself and continuing to look at different perspectives and ways of seeing things. One of the things, actually, I just wanted to get back to, you were talking about ammonium nitrate's role as an accelerant here. This is one of the things that confused me, because you were also describing how it had a sort of TNT equivalent for the blast. Now, it makes sense to me that like a combination of an accelerant and some firecrackers, not even fireworks, I think they were literally first built as firecrackers, combination of accelerant, even a lot of oxygen and some firecrackers, isn't going to produce like a small nuclear warhead equivalent of force, which is very obviously what you see in all of the video coming out of there. So I understand. That's one of the weirder things about this. But I just, on the role of it as an accelerant, again, because you're a chemist, I'm curious. How can, just briefly, how can I make sense of that? In other words, you first said that it had a TNT equivalent, which would sort of put it as its own explosive. But then you were describing its role to provide oxygen to a fire.
Because this is absolutely, there's an element to this I need to add that I didn't. So it's not, what we have here is not ammonium nitrate on its own. It's something called prilled ammonium nitrate, which means that there's actually fuel oil inside. So
wait, just Maram, I just want to, real quick so I can search this. What was the first word you said before ammonium nitrate?
Prilled, Prilled.
Thank you.
No problem. So basically, it's more explosive. It's more volatile than ammonium nitrate on its own would be, and because it has fuel oil added to it. But the amount of fuel oil added, the equivalent. That's why you get a TNT equivalent, because it's not like 50%. It's like a small percentage of fuel oil that's added. And so what they've measured, as far as I recall, don't quote me on this, this is terrible, but as far as I recall, it's like 15% by ton. So like 2,700 tons, you get a equivalency of 0.5 of the kiloton. So which means, but then the blast was 2.2, like as a minimum, basically. So there's a discrepancy. Just if it was just the prilled ammonium by itself, if what we're being told is correct, then we go back a step. If indeed there was 2,700 kilograms of the stuff, and that was correct, It should have only produced an equivalent of 0.5 kilotons, and yet the blast was 4 times that.
That's very interesting. I mean, yeah, and one of the first things that came to mind when I was looking at it, again, as a complete novice, but just throwing thoughts out there, was this idea that maybe there was some amount of not pressurization or something like that, but that any additional cumulative force you could have had as a result of the explosion. If you have a warehouse where there's a certain degree of air pressure and tension along the surface of the membrane of that warehouse or whatever, along the structure, then that could add to the explosion. Does that make any sense to you? Again, this is coming from somebody who probably doesn't know what he's talking about.
That's okay. Well, if you compress the stuff, surely, yeah, it could become, because of the concentration would increase because it's all like in one place. But in terms of like a warehouse, I don't see how, like when I'm talking about compression, I'm talking about like adding pressure to the ammonium nitrate. But I don't see how a building would make the explosion bigger. No, I don't. That's not true.
That's totally fair. Yeah, no, I'm happy to throw something out there and be revealed as completely wrong. Thank you, Maram.
Maram, I do have a question in our remaining time. I think we'll have about 3 minutes left. In the condition of Lebanon before the blast took place, there had been massive protests in Lebanon. I was beautiful protests, actually, in this kind of economic collapse and everything else that was taking place in the country. Could you give us a snapshot as to the economic space and the political space of Lebanon leading into this explosion and what is taking place there now in those areas because of the explosion?
Yes, absolutely. So there was already turmoil there. And it's important to note that some of that turmoil is because of government corruption. And I'm sure government corruption played a role in enabling a sabotage in the first place. So that's not to be discounted in the least. But the reason for all of the protests in Lebanon was the economic situation was getting worse and worse. And this is because of U.S. sanctions. U.S. sanctions, which, by the way, was recently increased, has basically driven the Lebanese economy to tatters. And people were not even able to access their own money, if that money meant anything at all anymore. And the reason for those sanctions is twofold. First is because Syria was basically able to circumvent the sanctions placed on it by going through Lebanon. And so they basically put a stop on the gap that we were using to survive, which is Lebanon. You know, so it's really also about Syria. It's about making sure Syria continues to be destroyed. The other thing is they wanted to pressure the Lebanese government to remove Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is part of the Lebanese parliament, part of the government, and you know they have the militia as well. So the claimed reason for the sanctions is to target Hezbollah, and therefore they wanted to turn people and the government against them in order to lift sanctions and basically drive them into desperation and all of these like economic pressures, and now the explosion. Just before that, I think Lebanon was actually in discussion with China to try to make new trade deals. So, but now they're basically reliant completely on aid, which definitely falls right into the hands of people like Macron. And if you want to go back a little bit, if we have time, the Lebanese constitution was built, by the French occupation in order to keep it very sectarian, such that each religion and each sect of the religions has its own political party, like a party for Sunnis, a party for Orthodox Christians, Catholic Christians, Shiites, and unfortunately, like the presidency, the prime minister, and the head of parliament all have to be specific religions. It's that sectarian. And
that's very interesting, Maram. We are out of time, but that's looking at the history from the founding of the Lebanese state in terms of the sectarian history. That's very interesting. We'd love to talk more about that, I'm sure. We'll have to cut it there, though. You've been listening to the voice of Maram Sousli, political commentator and geopolitical analyst. Thank you so much for joining us, Maram. We'll be back in just a minute with the last 2 hours of Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Thanks for listening.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever-vigilant, the last antibody to the sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in a solar-powered blimp floating above the Saharan desert, I am your investigative radio show host, Shane Stranahan. Jamarl?
Hello?
Jamarl?
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I'm sorry, there was a mic malfunction for a moment. I actually said I wanted to get with you in that blimp. That is an amazing place to be in a solar powered blimp. I love the imagery of that. And in fact, I want to get back to that after we do the headlines. So let's go through the headlines. In the news, Russia is claiming a coronavirus vaccination victory, with Vladimir Putin saying that one of his own daughters has already been inoculated with the COVID-19 vaccine and recovered, only seeing a slight boost in temperature after receiving each of the 2 shots. The vaccine has not seen widespread use of phase 3 testing, although the Russian Federation is currently undergoing more testing and planning on producing a ramp-up in September. And it said that the mass vaccination may begin as early as October. Last month, the United States, Britain, and Canada all accused Russia of using hackers to steal vaccine research from Western labs. Well, it is also possible that we were being monitored, let's say it that way, that those things were being monitored and understood that this was going to come out. Who knows? This is kind of interplay between nations at this point. Nevertheless, this is a positive for the world if this is indeed accurate. A shooting near the White House yesterday afternoon led the Secret Service to escort Trump out of a press briefing after a 21-year-old suspect near 17th and Pennsylvania told a Secret Service agent that he was armed before charging. Seattle Police Chief Carmen Bess is expected to announce her retirement after the local city council voted to reduce the department by approximately 100 officers through layoffs and attrition and cut $4 million from the department's $400 million budget. $4 million from $400 million. Great. Trump is getting pushback from state governors on the cost of paying for his executive order relief programs, with Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York saying that the aid was equivalent to handing a drowning man an anchor, quote unquote, with the orders set to cost the state up to $4 billion through the end of 2020, while California's Governor Gavin Newsom said that 25% match expected of states would cost the state roughly $700 million per week. That's probably the truth. Presidential primary day today in Connecticut has been rescheduled twice due to COVID-19. Registered voters are allowed to vote absentee because of the virus, and the state says 300,000 voters have filed applications for their ballots. There has been concerns about ballots getting to voters on time, although officials now say that nearly all ballots have been received by voters in time for today's election. Connecticut is one of the states especially hit hard by COVID-19, with over 50,000 cases confirmed and over 4,441 deaths attributed to the virus right now. Hawaii is setting a turnout record in the first all-mail-in primary and also setting the record for the number of votes cast in a primary election with 380,152. Honolulu voters also set an Oahu record for votes cast in the primary election with 256,344. The previous Honolulu record for a primary election was 225,406 votes. Cast was recorded in 1994. Last night, Judge Peter Cahill in the George Floyd case released police body camera footage of 2 Minneapolis police involved in the death of George Floyd. The footage, roughly an hour in length, comes from the body cameras of former officers Thomas Lane and J. Alexander Koenig. A majority of voters, including half of Democrats, think that 77-year-old presidential candidate and former Vice President Joe Biden will not serve all 4 terms if elected. That is a sad condemnation of our politics, and yet there we are. The number of people flying on commercial airlines is going up at this point in the pandemic, although passenger travel remains far below where it was last year. More than 830,000 people went through TSA checkpoints, the most since March 17th, although it's 70% fewer than the 2.5 million registered on the same Sunday last August. And last, a Northwest Baltimore gas explosion leveled 3 row houses Monday morning, killing 1 person and leaving 7 others injured. The Baltimore Gas and Electric Company said in a statement that no gas readings were found in any of the buildings and no leaks were found in the gas main. The fire department is still conducting a search for survivors. And those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So the story that I want to talk about is the COVID, the virus and the vaccine for that virus that was coming out, or that the news is coming out from the standpoint of Russia. I watched the video of Vladimir Putin's daughter being injected with the vaccine. And, you know, in real terms, this is kind of a contest among nations, even though there are real consequences to this. By definition, if America is the exceptional nation and the indispensable nation, and we are indeed one that has the most wealth of all of the countries that any nation has ever seen before, then you would think that that wealth would be applied to good ends and to ensuring that the vaccine was produced here first. I understand that looking at this as a contest is somewhat grim, but if you were ahead in charge of nations and those nations were in competitions, you would indeed look at this stuff as to some degree a competition. I would hope at some point that if the world was being hit by a virus where all of these people were contracted the virus, thousands, hundreds of thousands have died from that virus, that the world will look at this as a challenge for the world, not just a thing for individual nations and contests. That is clearly not where we are, and perhaps that's a bit too Pollyannish for our own time frame. But I would hope that that's where our world goes. In the short term of it, in the temporary part of it, look, I don't care which nation comes out with this vaccine first. I understand if America came out with it first, they would chest stuff. So I have no feelings about Russia doing the same. I am more so bothered by this notion that it is indeed a contest, as opposed to the world looking at it as something that we're presented with the challenge, and that we, presented with a world challenge, comes out with solutions and, I don't know, work together for that challenge to accommodate it. That's unfortunately not where we are, and we are at this point of competition. I would say this also, though. Your nation, the United States, has decided to not use the Defense Production Act in a timely fashion, decided to not push these companies to produce these drugs, decided not to put limits on the amount of money that the oligarchs can make for these things in this country, instead focused on the interests that they're most suited to, meaning we're going to allow you to produce as much profit as you want to off of these drugs, even if it's drugs that we help create, and even if the amount that these things cost are minor in comparison to what they're going to charge for them. We have some screwed up policies in this country, and it's not a rationality around this notion of what's in the best interest of health and human happiness. It's one around profit, and that is being shown in this virus. I don't know if anything else that much more clear that is being shown in this virus. Now, we do have callers, but Shane, I'm going to get to your point first. How do you see this? I know oftentimes you see this stuff as, let's find a technological way out of it, and let's find ways to lower the cost of the stuff. But you notice, I think, for yourself in looking at the way this virus and how our congressional leaders have dealt with it, that with the medication that's coming out, they didn't ensure that the cost was going to remain low for the people who were purchasing it. They did remain or make sure that it was short or lower for the people who were producing it. So how do you ever get that technological solution where the cost of things goes so low when you have companies that are basically accepting the lowering of that cost, but increasing the amount that they're charging other people who need that drug?
I'll start it like this. I grew up being mostly interested in tech and less interested in society, or less interested in social affairs. I was interested in philosophy and stuff, or sort of the interface between the two. And then it kind of flipped as I got older, and now I'm a lot more interested in the social stuff. And the reason for that is, if you have a technological solution or an implementation or just an idea for a reform or some way of going about improving society, technically, like by making specific changes or by creating a technology that people can use, and if the vehicle for change in some sense on some basic level is the expansion of our abilities through our technologies, then I think that it's really important to be able to get that stuff through. But here's my point. To do that, you need that political end. You need to understand how to navigate society, and you need to understand, frankly, how society works on some level, at least in some domains, so that you can work in that real terrain, in the actual terrain of the instantiation and the enaction of whatever technological changes you want to try to experiment with and test. I'm going to bring that back to the level of the nation state. The United States, I try to criticize, and you criticize pretty often too, the institutions, the like undergirdings, the structural and bureaucratic and sort of functional day-to-day institutions. I'll put it like this, actually. We had Chris Hedges on yesterday. He briefly mentioned the name, it wasn't Samuelson, forgive me, Huntington, Samuel Huntington, pardon me.
Oh,
no, yeah, he mentioned the Lewis Powell memo from, I think, 1972 or something like that, but also he mentioned Samuel Huntington very briefly, who wrote this book, The Clash of Civilizations. Anyway, Samuel Huntington has this definition of institutions where I'm pretty sure if you still go to Wikipedia and you literally look up the word institution, you'll find this definition right up at the top. And he basically says, I'm going to paraphrase it, institutions are basically these sort of, I can quote it directly, stable, valued, recurring patterns of behavior, where on a small level you have these habits, again, stable, valued, recurring pattern of behavior. It's a pattern of behavior that is stable, that maintains itself through the long run. It is valued, so we give it value and we evaluate those patterns of behavior. And it recurs. It's something that's sort of cyclical. It's not constant. For instance, the institution of marriage is not a constant thing. It comes in cycles where you get married at a certain point usually, and it's a stable institution generationally, but it recurs. Anyway, you can think of bureaucracies as composed of these institutions. So there are these two definitions of the word floating around that I just want to clarify real quick. There's one in which an institution is an organization, like a bureaucracy, and there's another in which it's like something like marriage, like this pattern of behavior. But you can think of those bureaucracies as composed of these patterns of behavior. And if you really want to criticize them, if you want to look at them, I think what you need to do is look at a structural breakdown of those institutions using the lens of individual institutions, of the patterns of behavior that compose these bureaucracies. Anyway, there's so much analysis that could be done there. I'm going to bring it back to the government. What we need, I think, is you sort of set my perspective up as a technological perspective, but I'm going to say we need a sort of social perspective on this. What we need is a better way of understanding our institutions, and that really is civics. And I think we could develop a new kind of civics in the modern era, from the grassroots, from the bottom up potentially, outside of the academia, because I don't see academia doing a great job at this right now. And I think that would help us tremendously with our ability to overhaul it. With the vaccine and this idea of a prestige race between Russia and the United States, I'm trying to build back up from the ground level here. We could, if our institutions were functional, if the political institutions of the United States were functional years or decades ago, there was ample opportunity to prepare for literally exactly this type of virus. For a coronavirus, a member of this family that had pandemic potential in the past, it was all there, clear as day. It's not like this was a Byzantine or obscure or esoteric thing that we could have prepared for. It was pretty darn clear that something like this could happen. So the fact that we didn't is either, I'll put it as a glaring sign of incompetence. Some people would see it not just as negligence, but malintent. I would just see it as incompetence, potentially underfunding, but broadly, that's just another sign of incompetence. And here's the thing, with this prestige race, it's not just about prestige. It's also that this kind of task is an honest test of competence. If your country can roll out a vaccine, if it is able to get something like that done, then for all international observers, for everybody in the investor class, for every other party official high up in some other government, you have not just a sign that this government can do something, but you also have a fairly publicized analysis of how functional and dysfunctional various governments are. So this moment as a sort of window into political change, I think that's absolutely a lens that we can bring on the high level, looking at how nation states see each other. But I think we should also see this as an opportunity for ourselves, for each of us, to interrogate those institutions and try to change them too. I think that's the most important task in some sense for a lot of people in our time. And here's another way we're going to go into a break. Sorry for kind of rambling there, Jamarl. But
no, I love that explanation. I was writing in the chat. I was like, I love that explanation of institutions. That's perfect. When I make the argument and ask people, is there anything objective to you that goes outside that's beyond the other party? Like if, it's like I believe in Social Security so much that I would never vote for anybody that would vote against it. Okay, well, that's something that I can define you by almost in regards to what you're willing to support and not. That's what keep asking that question. And so that's why I love your definition of institutions, or the definition that's given for institutions. This kind of reoccurring stable set of values that recreate themselves over and over again in order to kind of propagate themselves throughout time. Love that. So no, I think you're doing fine. I love it.
No, thank you. Yeah, no, we should go into a break. We'll be back in just a minute. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. We've got a few callers already. We'll be with you in a minute. Again, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people.
Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
We actually let them expand on their views.
What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are taking calls this segment. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. Real quick note, you can listen to us on the radio in D.C., Washington, D.C., 105.5 and FM and 1390 AM. We're also on in Kansas City, 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM. We're also online. You can listen to our audio on Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, and Spotify. You can also watch our videos on YouTube. Just do a search for either Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas. Either one of those search strings will lend you a query. Will lend you a quick result. You'll find live YouTube videos every morning, 3-hour-long videos. Jamarl's has video. Over on twitter.com/faultlinesradio. Over on Twitter, we have our live Periscope. You can also find us there. But again, we're taking calls this segment, 202-521-1320. I'll try to keep this to about 15 seconds. I think there's a huge opportunity right now to change our political institutions, and I think it's damn exciting too. I think a lot of people forget that in times of crisis, one of the best things you can find is some reliable strategy. If you can think through some strategy or get involved in something that can change something, that's an exciting moment. If you can engage in that process, then you might be able to do a lot of good. And I think that's a moment that we're in right now, and it's a little bit easy to forget that while we're all at home. But let's go to callers. We're taking calls 202-521-1320. We've got Michael calling in from Silver Spring. Michael, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hey, happy birthday, Shane.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate it.
Just wanted to, you have no problem. Happy birthday. I want to ask, is it possible that all the different nations of the planet, the leaders of those nations are friends, and they're just trying to pretend like they're not to divide the people? Is that possible at all? And if so, what would be the purpose? And also, I want to say I agree with Lynn. Yeah, go ahead, please. So I want to say I agree with Lynn that Donald Trump has ties with the Italian mafia, and I'm sure President Biden does too. And the media is just repeating information. They're not really finding firsthand information. Just like repeating information. Like the other day, I think I heard President Trump say that we reached our highest point as far as jobs. Like we've had the best job growth the past 3 months. And his most recent, he did it 2 days ago when he unveiled all those bills that he was going to sign or whatever executive orders. I mean, so I don't think that doesn't sound like it's. I don't think that personally, from my own personal experience, I don't think that that's possible that we could have accelerated employment.
No, I don't see that as possible either. I mean, real quick comment with the Italian mafia thing. Honestly, that wouldn't surprise me, largely just because of the real estate in New York, and there's a lot of legacy mafia money in real estate in some centers, obviously in the U.S. like New York. So that wouldn't surprise me too much. I haven't looked into it too deeply. Anything on that, real quick, tomorrow? We can go back to his first thing.
So in World War I, before the First World War took place, many of these governments were kingdoms. They were run by kingdoms. I mean, there's no other way to say it. Basically, a ruling class, a ruling elite of people who were royalty. They were friends I mean, they had associations with one another where they could talk and they had interactions and everything else. That didn't stop these guys from getting into a larger war, especially when the militarism and that type of stuff kind of goes up where one country can't trust the other. And so the very act of you having a gun necessitates that I have something that can defend myself in a similar way. Like, those things evolved regardless of those people being in some level of associations with one another. If I'm not mistaken, family. So I don't know if that is in and of itself enough of a protection that they may interact or engage with one another. So I understand that point. That doesn't stop us from sleepwalking into a war. And I think that's my biggest concern. Like, for example, when we killed and murdered Soleimani, Iran and how they responded, we had no control over it. It was off the table for us. Meaning, however Iran responded, we could have responded in a particular way, or they could have responded in a way where all powers would have been pushed to the president. You must respond to what they did, despite the fact that we're the ones that murdered Soleimani. I'm making the point that that could happen. I mean, something in the South China Sea could happen where the government of China can't necessarily back away, requiring a stronger position mandated by the public, in which case you have the hardliners in the United States who has already seeded the population that China is horrible and bad and everything else, in which case the politics of our country demand a response. Like, you can fall into those situations. Those things are not necessarily, they may be accidental, but they're going to be gruesome nonetheless. So, whether they're friends or not is almost irrelevant. And how do you deal with that? You deal with that in the same way you continuously deal with it now. That you recognize that their interests are in alignment in the same way that our interests, especially on issues of class, are in alignment. And you function in kind. I care less about what goes on in the back rooms. I care more about what we do in response to that and what we're willing to do, meaning letting various people fail and not going along with this nonsense like settle for Biden. You have ideas and policies that you want that is in your best interest, your family's best interest, and you push for those things. And it has nothing to do with a hope and change Obama who doesn't believe in those things, or some random black person that they're going to affirmatively action put in for Joe Biden. And I don't even know why that's not somewhat offensive in and of itself. But nevertheless, I guess my point is, whether they're friends or not is almost secondary to the point that you have things that you want and that the public wants. And our objective is to figure out how to get those things and make those things realizable.
Well, that should be paramount. I think ethically, the ideal is that the public should be most represented in government, more represented than the government itself, per se, as a sort of directing entity or something like that. I think, that's slightly off field, off topic. But getting back to whether or not leaders are friends, I think two ways of looking at this. They're probably more than two, actually. Probably more cordial than we'd expect, based on how aggressive some of the communications are on the high level. So I could see, for instance, if Trump and Xi Jinping were to have a call pretty soon, I don't think they would be yelling at each other. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a degree of tension there. I mean, another way of looking at this is that humans are humans. I don't think that people on a high level completely change their nature. Power affects them, and they have to sort of shift their perspective and act on other agencies than their own, act in other ways than they might just as their own person. And they're probably very self-considered about that in a lot of cases, Trump included. So that's going to change how they relate to each other. But humans are humans. I think the real level that you want to look at is either institutionally, in terms of ties. So say you're a part of the CIA, just taking an example, you're probably going to have some sort of long-term enmity with other intelligence agencies, with Russia. You're going to have this weird, a weird stack of relationships with different competing forces, that allows you to, there's some degree of tension there, and that just comes with the institution. Just as an example of how, if you're elected up through an administration and that administration is steeped in views of other administrations, even ones that are less modulated by ethics and more modulated by the interest of the state, even if they're not ethical convictions, there's going to be a certain amount of tension latent in the institution. And people are going to pick up on that, and they're going to express that. Another thing is actually families. So Jamarl brought up the legacy of monarchy in Europe around, before the fall of World War I and after it. I mean, that definitely holds. And another way to look at this is that the most prominent people around the world are members of families with deep political connections, families in some sense are still really the vehicle of power. And so if you want to look at the connections, it can be very illustrative to look at the connections that people in power have with other people sort of behind the scenes in terms of family ties or close personal ties. That can be very useful. And that does affect the shape that decisions take. I don't think that there's a consortium on the highest level where all of the world leaders are sort of in agreement about pretty much everything or even most things. I mean, it seems like there's pretty substantial room for disagreement, you know? Let's go to Jonathan, though. Jonathan in Potomac, you're on the line. Jonathan.
He's gone.
Oh, he's gone, apparently. Jonathan sadly dropped. We were taking calls, 202-521-1320. Jamarl, anything you wanted to say in response to what I was saying there?
So, yes. So, I like this idea. I like the way you explain it. And I think that's all the more fair. Here's a question. If a person had a weapon and they were engaged in a situation, let's say for a moment, you came up on a scene, two people were, I don't know, maybe arguing or something. Maybe one was a female, one was a guy. You thought that they were being belligerent. If you had a weapon, if you had a gun, do you engage that situation in the same way you would as if you didn't have a gun? And this can be same true for cops, right? If there is some kind of domestic dispute or there's some kind of dispute, a cop comes to a scene. If you have a gun, do you act differently? The reason I'm asking this has to do with this notion of institutions and the pressure and the latent pressure that's put on people in institutions to behave a particular way. I'm also getting into this notion that as human beings or human beings to some degree, that those human beings moderate their actions and their opinions, even in the way they respond to something, depending upon the level of strength that they have at their disposal or force at their disposal, in this case, for example, with a weapon. I guess I'm trying to get to something very basic. If people are people, yes, and people in those institutions are what they are, that's also true. But a person who's sitting at the helm of an institution with nuclear weapons, I think it's a little bit different than somebody sitting at the helm of an institution without them. And when we come to the forefront of something, meaning when Obama take that office, when Trump take that office, when Bill Clinton take that office, or Hillary or Biden or whatever, they sit there with this idea of what it means to be head of America. And I think in their heads, it's the same thing that was going through the heads of people in Britain with this notion of being head of the world. You know, we're the white man's burden of sorts. We need to keep up the burden of the world. We're Atlas holding the world on our shoulders. I think to some degree that sickness infects their brain. So any notion of having, okay, let's have a politics where we try to make the world a better place is off the table in lieu of, I need to ensure that America becomes the number one and remains the number one country, the indispensable nation. What do you think about that? I know we only have 3 minutes, but does that push back on the notion of institutions, or is that a reaffirming of sorts of the institution, that institution being, we're number one and we're going to keep it that way?
Well, I think, fundamentally, one of the basic kinds of institution is that, like, if you organize them together, you get states at a certain point, and states are built to contain violence in both senses of the word. So states are founded on the use of violence, but they're also founded on the suppression of violence. And the only way, as far as I can tell, that you can suppress violence is with the use of violence. On that basic level, it operates on that field. The question there is, you know, do police have legitimacy? Should we give police the legitimate use of violence in society? And that's definitely being tested right now. A lot of people are disagreeing about that. I think that
but I'm asking that question on a higher country level. I know I use the cops that would give their explanation. I guess I'm making a point that the cop had a billy club versus a gun. But right, I'm just talking about states themselves and the powers that our government has at its disposal. I mean, we spend like $1 trillion on nuclear weapons. And if we didn't have that much cash, or for that matter, that many weapons, or nuclear weapons at all at our disposal, we as a country would behave differently. This goes to the sovereign currency thing. We would behave differently if the United States wasn't a sovereign currency. Or for that matter, if there was a secondary force where this wasn't a unipolar world, but this was a multipolar world, our behavior in the world is different under those guidelines. That's all I'm getting at. That it goes beyond what's right. It goes beyond even the pressure of the institution. And to some degree, it goes into what's at that person's disposal when that person gets into office as either president of our country or president of another nation that's considered a power in their region. It influences the individual. I don't think it's something as simple as to say that people are people. I think those people are greatly influenced by the institutions to which those people operate in and in the legacy of those institutions. Meaning, we're supposed to be this, and so this is my interpretation of this, and so I'm going to expound this across the world. And if that means that we're going to undermine Venezuela, that's what we do. If it means that we tell China to keep your forces out of that area, that's what we do. And the consequences matter less because of the ideas in their head about what it means to be exceptional. I think it's just really, I think it's the same idea of a person with a gun. I guess that's what I'm getting at, the psychology of that stuff. But let's go to a break. We're going to have Chuck Zlatkin with us, legislative and political director of the New York Metro Area Postal Union, to discuss the actions that are taking place to attack the postal service in this country. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined by Chuck Zlatkin for this segment. He's the legislative and political director. He's a legislative and political director for the New York Metro Area Postal Union. Chuck, how are you doing this morning?
Good. Very good. Thank you for having me on the program.
Hey, thank you for joining us. All right. I'll start here, I suppose. We have Louis DeJoy as the new Postmaster General. That's as of May of this year. He's made a bunch of changes. Those are seriously impacting the quality of service, apparently, of the USPS, turning into a major political controversy. Stuff like cutting down on overtime pay and apparently slowing down the delivery of packages. Can you please take us back? Megan Brennan preceded him. She'd been in since February of 2015. Can you maybe, what are some of the differences, just looking in the recent history, between her and him after he's come in? What has he done? Let's just start there, Chuck. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Well, Megan Brennan came through the system, was a career postal worker, worked her way up, and was committed to keeping public postal service. That's probably the main difference between her and DeJoy, because DeJoy comes from the private sector, and his only involvement with the postal service was as a contractor for a private firm. And Brennan went before Congress to talk about the financial crisis that the Postal Service was having because of the pandemic. And DeJoy is coming with a different attitude about what needs to be done for the Postal Service. So you mentioned, let me just make one thing clear. The Postal Service is labor intensive. There's a lot of workers, a lot of 30,000 post offices, trucks delivering the mail, and lots of people working in the post office. Years ago, postal management decided that it was cheaper for them to use overtime when necessary than to hire more employees. So that's been the philosophy or the practice of the Postal Service for a number of years. So that's what overtime is used in peak periods when there's needs for it or whatever. So during the pandemic, the need for overtime has been greater because 2,500 postal workers have been affected with the disease. 40,000 at times have had to been quarantined, and over 75 have died. So to get the mail out, you have to have more overtime. By eliminating overtime and having a hiring freeze, you're saying that's no longer our priority, is to move the mail and to get it out in a timely fashion. Is also so the mission of the Postal Service is to provide prompt, reliable, and efficient service to the American people. The joy, prompt, and reliable isn't a concern. His thinking of efficiency is get the trucks going out on their schedule, have them stay on schedule. If there's extra mail, the mail's been delayed, you don't keep the truck there and get the mail out. You just move the truck and the mail will stay for an extra day. Well, if the mail moves through 3 or 4 different places going from one place to another, that could be a delay of 3 or 4 days. The reason for that, it's not to save money, because the money saved is basically a minimal amount. What it does is it destroys confidence and reliability in time that the American people have in the Postal Service. And if you eventually want to destroy the system, privatize it, the first thing you have to do is break that bond between the American people and the Postal Service, which has only been reinforced by what the Postal Service has meant to people during this pandemic. People have understood, even the first time, once again, that the Postal Service has been there for them.
Chuck, I agree with you 1,000%. This is one of our favorite industries in this country. And I agree with you that in order to undermine it, you have to somehow sabotage it. And this is just one of the latest techniques that they've used to try to sabotage the functioning of the Postal Service. In 2006, Congress passed a law that required the U.S. Postal Service to pre-fund 75 years worth of retiree health benefits in the span of 10 years, a cost of approximately $110 billion. Now, this is not something that other companies have to contend with. This is not something companies have to deal with. And yet this was put on the Postal Service, again, to make it that much more difficult for the company to function. When Democrats got in 2008 under Obama, they didn't fix this. They didn't repair this. They basically let it ride, going all the way to the point where Donald Trump can now make this worse by trying to sabotage it that much more. Can you explain how difficult it has been to try to deal with this 75-year provision, and that the American public basically knows nothing or little about it?
Well, when this was brought in 2006, it was done on the last days of Congress. It was midnight. There was voice votes. Most of the people who voted for it didn't even know what they were voting for. It seemed to sound good. It's called the Postal Accountability Enhancement Act. But it was designed at a time in 2005, 2006, when the Postal Service was doing well. Now, the way it's organized since 1970, it's supposed to basically break even, use the income from the sale of stamps and postal products, no government funding for the Postal Service to function. But what's happening is that they were having a surplus. What to do with the surplus? So someone came up with the idea to pre-fund future retirees' health benefits. We're talking about people not only who haven't even worked for the Postal Service yet, who haven't even been born over the 75-year period. So it created a situation where every September 30th, the Postal Service had to write a check to the U.S. Treasury for $5.5 billion. And they managed to do it the first number of years, but then in 2008, when the financial crisis happened, it became difficult for the Postal Service to make those payments. And at that point, they used that as an excuse to start cutting back in service and closing plants. So it's always been difficult. But the point of fact is that without that burden that Congress created, the Postal Service would be doing fine, even in the era of the internet, where people are saying it's no longer needed. But the reality is that, yes, there's fewer people are writing letters to grandma, but all the people who are ordering stuff on the internet has to be delivered. They haven't figured out how to get the packages through the computer yet. It has to be delivered. And even the packages that the competitors use, UPS and FedEx, they only want to deliver to where it's profitable. the Postal Service is required to give universal service, meaning that everybody everywhere in the country is entitled to delivery no matter where they live, what zip code, how much money they make, who they are, what their background. Everyone's entitled to that. So what the FedEx and UPS do is they put millions of packages into the mail for what the last mile and have the post office deliver it for them to where it's not profitable. See, people don't realize sometimes you get something sent to you and it's delivered by the Postal Service. They don't realize that it's a FedEx package or a UPS package that's being delivered by the post office because they don't want to deliver where it's not profitable while the post office has to. So it has been a burden on the Postal Service that it's been able to meet, much to the displeasure of the people who want to privatize. So DeJoy comes in, who is a crony and a big fundraiser for Trump. They said they did an extensive nationwide service. The Postal Board of Governors approved all Trump appointees, and he comes in with a logistics background, and you say, okay, this is someone who maybe can fix what's wrong, but what he's put into play, cutting the number of employees, eliminating overtime, and now what he did on last Friday was to take all the senior postal executives and move them around into areas that they haven't worked or whatever. This is all while the pandemic is still going on, while people are depending upon the Postal Service more so than ever to have packages delivered. I mean, most people don't realize that the Postal Service delivers 1.2 billion medical prescriptions every year. Now, this is like life-saving medications that keep people sane, that keep people from excruciating pain. The VA has already come out with an announcement to the people saying you have to start changing the way you put in your prescriptions because they're already seeing delays. So the whole purpose of this is not to save the post office and make it stronger. It's to give reasons for people to say, hey, the post office isn't reliable, so they can privatize it. And the privatizes, I mean, this is a battle that they've been fighting for 50 years that's come to the best opportunity under Trump.
Exactly.
Do you think, I mean, it seems like that at least among the public, at least among the media, I'm seeing a lot of pushback on Louis DeJoy. Do you think that it's going to backfire? In other words, if Louis DeJoy was trying to lower public opinion of the U.S. Postal Service, do you think he might just lower public opinion of himself and Trump instead? Or do you think this is going to have a serious impact on how people see it if this continues?
Well, I mean, that's an excellent point because that's really what the battle that's being fought right now. Because the joy came in. I mean, the Postal Service as an independent government agency has oversight in both houses of Congress. He ignored that. There's a Postal Board of Governors that he's supposed to follow. There's a Postal Regulatory Commission, and he also has contracts with the labor unions that represent the workers to negotiate wages, benefits, hours, working conditions. He ignored all of them and just went ahead and did whatever he pleased, kind of similar to the president himself. So then when the pushback came, he started, coming up with his explanations and stories. He's a very effective speaker, but you really have to watch what he does, not what he says. So yes, there's a lot of good press. There have been demonstrations and petitions in areas where local people have already seen what the impact has meant to them, because he was, closing post offices early, going to eliminate them, cutting back. I mean, it was really like a hatchet job. So really the thing that's necessary is for people to, take action, to respond, and very much you're right. But one thing that Brennan did, the outgoing postmaster, who was the first female postmaster in the history of the United States, she went before Congress and said, we need relief because of the cutback in business because of the pandemic. That's the Postal Service. That's where they get their income from. And if there isn't financial relief, which we need to get from Congress, the post office could run out of money. Now they're saying somewhere between March and October of 21. That's
Chuck,
not a concern.
let's continue this conversation. Wait, Chuck, let's continue this conversation when we get back. I'm sorry to interrupt. You guys are listening. The Voice is Chuck Zlatkin, Legislative and Political Director of New York Metro Area Postal Union. We'll be back in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Fault Lines.
Well, that was quick, and we're back.
That was a quick
to Fault
turnaround.
Lines with Thomas. Yeah, we're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're joined by Chuck Zlatkin, Legislative and Political Director for the New York Metro Area Postal Union. Chuck, you were starting to talk about, we've been talking about money. We've been talking about deficits and both pay to employees for overtime work. Now we're talking about deficits in the USPS as a whole. I was looking into the effects of the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act, which is the law you were talking about in 2006. Billions in dollars in debt, the vast majority, tens of billions of dollars in debt, accrued very quickly after this in the next decade, from 2007 to 2016. Just checking it out quickly on Wikipedia, the USPS lost $62.4 billion, and the Inspector General of the USPS estimated that $54.8 billion of that was due to pre-funding retiree benefits. So in other words, the vast majority of the money that was lost during that decade period was lost basically because the USPS had to do what no other public or private entity has to do, which is pre-fund retiree benefits decades and decades and decades in advance. So it's just very interesting to see that, and it's also interesting to see how harshly that impacted them and how much of their debt was due to that. I want to come back to this though. You were talking about potentially the post office running out of money. Did I hear that right in 2021?
Right. That's because their income is what it uses to fund the services. So in the CARES package, the first stimulus, or what they call a third stimulus, I guess, the CARES package had within it $25 billion that was that the House passed in relief that didn't have to be paid back, and a $10 billion line of credit. And Trump and Mnuchin said, if there's relief for the Postal Service in terms of a grant, we're not going to sign the bill. So the Democrats at that point, I guess, deciding that they didn't want to exercise whatever leverage they had, agreed. So what was in the bill was passed and then signed into law by the president was only the $10 billion line of credit. But at that point, they then decided, after it was in the law, that they were not going to allow the Postal Service to draw on that money, the loan, putting it further into debt, unless they agreed to certain conditions, which originally Trump had said to raise package prices by 400 to 500%, which would just basically drive all of the business away from the post office. And Mnuchin wanted all this credit, all this control over what the Postal Service was going to do. And Brennan refused to go along with that because she wasn't going to give it all away, the powers that set up throughout the oversight government, whatever. But DeJoy has signed that agreement with Mnuchin to get access to the $10 billion. He's agreed to give all the contracts to the 10 biggest customers that the Postal have, to give Mnuchin power to decide over how the post office is administered. See, this is a consolidation under Trump to have power over what's happening in the Postal Service. When the Postal
Chuck,
Service...
It is a consolidation of power. Wait, just real quick. Yes. It is a consolidation of power. But every time I listen to this, I keep thinking to myself, between 2006 to now, there was a Democratic administration that had the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And at no time does it seem like they pulled this lever back any. Meaning, the worst aspect of Democrats is basically consolidating what Republicans have gained. And here we have the post office, beloved. Look at the polling on it. Beloved by the country, under assault going back to 2006, and now being basically the assault completed to some degree, with the utter attempt at outright destroying the Postal Service. I've had friends of mine who were part of unions and who looked at Democrats and just thought, all right, well, I don't want to say anything bad about them because at the very least, they don't do us like Republicans. But they would tell you in the secrecy between the two of you that, yeah, they leave us the down the vine. And because they leave us the down the vine, that we still don't necessarily have any assertive pushback on the political space, because what we don't want is to have both parties actively against us, as opposed to one party just basically not caring one way or the other about us. Do you have any sense in regards to how you guys are politically thinking about this, where there's a feeling of betrayal by Democrats in this process, and for that matter, even a pushback in regards to resistance or what you guys need to think about and to do? Because at this point, you guys are not just a service. You guys are also a political body because you're being treated as such. How did you guys view Democrats in this process? And beyond how you view Democrats, what are you going to do from your own abilities to try to stem the tide of what they're clearly trying to do, which is to destroy the Postal Service?
Well, it's a very good point. But understand, even though the Republicans were in power in 2006, this legislation was bipartisan. It had bipartisan support. And you're exactly correct, because in 2009, when the Democrats had control of the White House and both houses of Congress, they did nothing on this. And if you look at the appointments that Obama, as he was leaving, was making to the Postal Board of Governors, he was nominating all these privatizers, the worst of people. James Miller, who was a leading privatizer, supposedly helped in the writing of the 2006 bill. He was being nominated by Obama for the Postal Board of Governors. And he would have gotten in if it wasn't for Bernie Sanders, who blocked it. He used his power to stop them. And in a sense, some of the appointments that Trump has made haven't been as bad as the ones that Obama was nominating. But it's bipartisan, of course. I was in Washington. I was working for the National Union from 2014 to 16. And what we were trying to do is get a meeting with President Obama, with the 4 postal unions that collectively represented over 6,000 employees, to meet with the president. Many of the unions that had supported him, and he wouldn't even meet with the president. I mean, the Republicans would meet with the president, but Obama wouldn't. So this illusion that somehow, the Democrats in certain areas are different than Republicans, well, in a sense, they're serving the same interests, the big corporate interests, because there are big, powerful corporations who've been financing this move for privatization, for decades, wanting to get their hands on that money. Understand, the Postal Service as a service, as I said earlier, labor intensive. The employees make a living wage and get benefits, and there are lots of them. Private companies look at that and say, wow, if we get in there and it's privatized, we could, hire people, at-will workers at minimum wage and use all that money for profit. So on one hand, you had that element pushing for privatization, and also you had the ideologues who are against big government, and they hate the Postal Service because the Postal Service is an example of how government can work and is popular with the government. So those two forces together have been pushing for privatization for a long time. So while there are Democrats who've helped, as I mentioned, some people, but even now in this latest negotiation with the HEROES Act, originally in there was a $25 billion grant for the Postal Service to bail it out. We just heard the other day that in their negotiations, where the Republicans and Democrats haven't gotten to negotiations, but when the Democrats came and said, well, we'll lower our package from $3.4 trillion by $1 trillion if you come up $1 trillion, part of the lowering of it was lowering the demands for the Postal Service from $25 billion to $10 billion. And that's our supposedly good friends of Pelosi and Schumer. So as postal workers, we're very aware of what goes on and who our friends are and who does what. It's a constant struggle. We cannot be taken for granted by either party or any politicians. Again, it's like when we look at the joy, it's not what you say, it's what you do. So we're constantly, putting pressure and staying on top of these elected officials. I mean, Schumer, while he's the ranking leader in the Senate, he's also a New York senator. So for our union, we're constantly speaking with him and putting on pressure and trying to remind him of what this means, not just for us, the employees, but what it means for his constituents to have a postal service that will deliver to them in a pandemic. That this is important. That it's not just the voting by mail, which is a whole other aspect of this struggle, which is another motivation, for President Trump to degrade the service at this particular point, and also the joy, while he claims that that his relationship with Trump will not in any way impact his service to the American people. But look at what he's doing. He's cutting back service. That's the only thing you can say. He's delaying the mail, and we've seen it all over the country, not only from our own employees, but now from customers who are contacting us, that the mail is already being delayed. So
but Chuck, just to interrupt for a moment, you guys realize, though, that as the political director, that they don't care about that. Like, Trump doesn't care that those people aren't going to get their drugs. DeJoy doesn't care that people aren't going to get their packages. The entire point of DeJoy being in that office is to ensure that people don't get their packages and to ensure that people don't get their medication, meaning they're trying to destroy the Postal Service. You guys who are politically working in this know this, even if the American public doesn't. So having an argument in regards to, hey, you're going to adversely affect grandma getting her meds, or hey, these guys are doing this to undermine. None of those things really work in the grand scheme of things, because that argument is not being made directly to the people who are doing it. That argument is basically being made to the public that is not entirely clearly aware of what is taking place. What are the political options for this? Because this is, again, I know part of the politics is the argument.
Well, the thing is that you have to educate the public, because it is the public that they're going to have to deal with, and it's the public that can force their elected officials. I mean, part of the reason that the Postal Service hasn't already been done in is because in rural states, it's even more important for the people there to keep a public postal service, and the people who are being elected there understand that. So if there's enough of a pushback from their constituents about keeping a public postal service, and it may cost them, being reelected, then at that point they say to McConnell, well, listen, we need you to take a stand against Trump. We're talking about the Republicans here, because again, it's going to be people's actions that's going to deal with it. It's going to be the pressure that people put on the government, because let's face it, these elected officials, they care about who? They care about pleasing their big donors, and their big donors are the ones who want the privatization. The people who are against it have to mobilize. It's already happened. People are organizing demonstrations, petitions, phone calling. I mean, our national union had a call-in date to Senate. We hope to get 10,000 phone calls to senators saying that we needed this emergency funding, and we got 30,000 phone calls came in. So yes, people don't know. But yeah, we're not going to ideologically change Trump's mind or reach out to DeJoy and change his opinion. His wife is Trump's nominee.
Chuck, sadly, we've got to cut it there. But for everybody listening, that was the voice of Chuck Zlatkin, legislative and political director at the New York Metro Area Postal Union. We will be back in just a minute with our final hour. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Thank you for coming on, Chuck.
to Radio Sputnik. Tell it.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, coming to you live from across the divided states of America, the most disruptive show in American politics. In the politically independent corner, I am investigative journalist Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last man on the wall with my birthday host, Shane Stranahan, Jamarl Thomas.
Thanks, Jamarl. Together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I realized I billed myself as an investigative journalist. That was a slip of the tongue. I really just mean radio show host. And I could just say radio show host, no investigative there. But we've talked about that before. Anyway, we're going to go into the headlines here. We do this every morning at 7, 8, and 9 a.m. Eastern. That's 4, 5, and 6 a.m. Pacific. And right after the first set of headlines, we usually go into Jamarl's monologue, but during the second and the third, we don't. So that's what we're doing. We are taking calls in this next segment, though. Starting in about 5 minutes, 202-521-1320 is the number to call, and we will be taking them. Let's go into headlines, though. Russia is claiming a coronavirus vaccination victory, with President Vladimir Putin saying that one of his own daughters has already been inoculated with a coronavirus vaccine, and that she recovered very quickly, only seeing a slight boost in temperature after receiving each of 2 shots. The vaccine has not yet seen widespread use. It also hasn't undergone phase 3 testing. That's leading the Russian Federation to draw a lot of flack. They, however, are currently undergoing more testing and are planning a production ramp up in September. They've also said that the mass vaccination of the Russian population, voluntary, just to note, may begin as early as October. Last month, the U.S., Britain, and Canada accused Russia of using hackers to steal vaccine research from Western labs. I believe they were also accusing China at one point. This may be just me inserting that, though. I want to go back and check. But anyway, I just want to point out they were accusing them last month of stealing vaccine research. Now, apparently, Russia's come out with its own vaccine that they've been testing. It just doesn't make sense to me that Russia would have done that. It's not like they would have had to have stolen a working vaccine to have done that. That seems like, again, one of these accusations that came out of nowhere. Anglo-American intelligence somewhere, I'm sure. In our next story, a shooting near the White House yesterday afternoon led the Secret Service to escort Trump out of a press briefing after a 21-year-old suspect near 17th and Pennsylvania told a Secret Service agent that he was armed and then started charging. In their next story, Seattle's police chief Carmen Best is expected to announce her retirement after the local city council voted to reduce the police department's police force by approximately 100 officers through layoffs and attrition, and to cut $4 million of the department's $400 million budget, so about 1% of that budget cut. In our next story, Trump is getting pushback from state governors on the cost of paying for his executive order relief programs. Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York has said that the aid was equivalent to, quote, handing a drowning man an anchor, end quote. The orders are set to cost his state up to $4 billion through the end of 2020. Meanwhile, California Governor Gavin Newsom said the 25% match expected of states would cost his state roughly $700 million per week. Again, states are supposed to pay 25% of the $400 weekly disbursement that Trump is trying to grant in his executive order. I say trying to grant because he has been getting pushback, of course, legally. And the rollout, we'll see when the rollout actually starts to happen and what that looks like. In our next story, presidential primary taking place today in Connecticut. It's been rescheduled twice so far due to the coronavirus. Registered voters there are allowed to vote absentee because of the virus, and the state has said that 300,000 voters so far have filled out applications for their ballots. There have been concerns about ballots getting to voters on time, although officials now say that nearly all ballots have been received by voters in time for today's election. Connecticut is one of the states hit especially hard by COVID-19, with over 50,000 confirmed cases there and over 4,441 deaths attributed to the coronavirus as of this morning. Over in Hawaii, meanwhile, they're setting a turnout record in their first all-mail-in primary, also setting the record for the number of votes cast in a primary election with 380,152. Honolulu voters also set an Oahu record for votes cast in a primary election. That record is 256,344. beating the previous record from 1994 of 225,406. So again, it seems like the mail-in voting from home thing is increasing voter turnout a bit. We'll see about that. Next story, last night, Judge Peter Cahill in the George Floyd case released police body cam footage from 2 Minneapolis police involved in the death of George Floyd. The footage, which is roughly an hour in length, came from the body cameras of former officers Thomas Lane, and J. Alexander Kuhn. In our next story, a majority of voters, including half of Democrats, think that 77-year-old presidential candidate and former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., to say his full name, will not serve all 4 years as president if he is elected. Again, a sad state of affairs in America as the leading as the Democratic nominee for the presidency. Apparently, about half of his voting base, or at least half of the party's base, says that they don't think he'll serve even 4 years if he's elected. It's terrible. Anyway, the number of people flying in commercial airlines is going up at this point in the pandemic after dropping down starting in March, although passenger travel does remain far below where it was last year. More than 830,000 people went through TSA checkpoints this Sunday, the most since March 17th, although that's 70% fewer than the 2.5 million registered on the same Sunday last August. In our last story today, a Northwest Baltimore gas explosion leveled 3 row houses Monday morning. It killed 1 person, left 7 others injured and hospitalized. Baltimore Gas and Electric Company said in a statement that no gas readings were found in any of the buildings and no leaks were found on the gas main. The fire department is still conducting a search for survivors. Those are the headlines. That's the top news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And again, we are taking calls this segment. The number there is 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320 is the number to call. Actually, one quick thing on the USPS stuff, just sort of finishing up our conversation with Chuck Zlatkin from the last segment we were talking. Again, Chuck Zlatkin, legislative and political director at the New York Metro Area Postal Union. I've actually heard from my mom, who lives up in Washington, does a bunch of gardening stuff. And she's been having postal delays, and she's been hearing about a bunch of other people having postal delays. So just on an anecdotal level, I hear it happening. It's a real thing. I mean, if you do searches, you'll hear a lot of other people describing it too. This isn't coming out of nowhere. It's just I heard that a couple of nights ago.
I think what people need to realize, though, is that whether they were getting a medication from the Postal Service, whether they were getting a package, whether they were getting some note of joy saying that, we're glad that you're okay, or condolences that you're not, whatever that thing is, the people who are in power right now don't care. You must understand, part of their mission is to ensure that that package doesn't get there, that pain medication doesn't get there, that note of love, or for that matter, that election ballot doesn't get there in a time frame. The reason that they wanted the Postal Service to increase their rates was because they wanted to make it that much more difficult to compete with either FedEx or one of the other postal services. I'm greatly bothered by this. This would be no different than if the NHS, which is constantly under attack by conservatives, was basically being carved up with the public just kind of standing by. The NHS was so valued by London, by the UK, that I don't remember the exact year of the Olympics, but they had an ode to their NHS. They were like skating and whatnot and all of this other stuff in love for their NHS. That gives you this notion of how any and every person that wants to get healthcare has the ability to do it, whether you have a dime to your name or not. And that is something that a society can look at and say, we've evolved to the point where this is now just true. We're not there. And even for something as basic as delivering the mail, the public takes this eye off the ball. And you have a Democratic Party that stands by while the Postal Service is completely and utterly destroyed, and a Republican Party that is chomping at the bit to do it and continue it. This is a problem. And this is what I mean when I say 95% of the elections are won by the side with the most cash. You have political leaders who spend 75% of their time begging for dollars. And when you have Obama who gets $1 billion to win a race, what do you think the political purview of those people are going to be ideologically? And it's going to be that, thank you for the cash. If you need the Postal Service served up, then that is what I'm willing to do in order to get the money necessary for me to win that race. So whether it's a Republican that wins, that will actively go after these organizations, or whether it's a Democrat that will leave them to die on the vine, both of these things are politically problematic and give some kind of idea and what we, as almost a society, is stuck with fighting against. I am so glad Chuck was able to come on to make this issue that much more clear and to explain it, to make it that much more palpable, the urgency of it, of something that needs to be done. I guess I look at this stuff and think these guys are political actors. They don't care one iota about whether medications or whether those things get there on time, or for that matter, whether even a postal service is the necessity of a postal service, kind of go that last mile and not have prices go up exorbitantly when grandma is trying to get her drugs in the middle of nowhere. This is problematic. I think it's a great big deal, and I'm glad that Chuck could come on to talk about it. So, Chuck, thank you again for coming on to explain the issue.
It is a big deal. It's a big deal. I mean, it's a big deal, especially because we're in a pandemic right now. This is one of those vital services you would need during a pandemic. We do need it. A lot of people are going to need it. And Chuck was a great guest. Thank you, Chuck, for coming on. And again, we are taking calls this segment. 202-521-1320 is the number you should call if you want to call us. 202-521-1320. I don't know where this stuff is going to go. We're seeing this absolute breakdown. Strike
would have been ideal. Now
that requires organization, and I don't think people are that organized.
But there are plenty of postal unions, and those postal unions could work together ideally. I mean, like you said, they're all unions and they're all postal services. And then I thought, well, is there a negative consequence to that from the standpoint of the image of the Postal Service by going on that strike? Or is what happens is the public galvanizes with them and agree that, no, we actually do want the Postal Service? I don't know which way it breaks.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that I don't know. How much have you been seeing this in the media? I'm seeing this almost every day, but as a minor story. Right. The Louis DeJoy USPS story. Is that about where you're seeing it, Jamarl?
Yeah, it is. I guess the question becomes, does it make it a major story the moment that those guys go on strike? For example, when you had the airline workers, Donald Trump says, I'm going to call a national emergency, and I'm going to say that me not getting my money for my wall as a national emergency, which means that the government had to basically furlough many of the workers. The workers, however, that worked at the airlines, the TSA agents, those guys who were going through the packages and ensuring that people are safe and whatnot, they still worked. Meaning, despite the fact that Trump has basically said, I am going to take this cadence because of a wall that's entirely a political instrument, I am perfectly okay with people going without a salary for 2 weeks or for 2 months. Now, that's disgusting, but that's where he was willing to go because he didn't necessarily care that those people were basically working despite not being paid for their work. If those people would have said, well, fine, if the president doesn't care about this issue to the point where he's willing to let us die on the vine, then our pain needs to be his pain, in which case they strike. Now, what happens when all of those airlines across the United States shut down? And would it give very real concerns that the nation's concerned are in line with the concerns of the people who are working at these areas that Trump is basically allowed to die on the vine? Meaning, as long as their pain is individual and is alienated from everyone else, then you can ignore them. You can do that. That can become a minor story. If the mail stops, or for that matter, all of the airlines shut down, that is now a major story. And the country that is basically was perfectly okay with ignoring you sitting in the corner crying to yourself is now crying with you because they have this thing now that they no longer can do based on the leverage that you've now exerted onto the system. I guess my question is, does that force that to be a higher story when people can't get their mail? Or does that allow basically private companies to step into the gap and try to that much more destroy the Postal Service even further? I don't know.
Yeah, and it'll probably affect the optics of workers at the Postal Service too. I mean, there are going to be some people who would be sympathetic to that, and then there are going to be other people who are just frustrated because their service is getting denied. But you know what? I think we should go to a break. We are taking calls. 202-521-1320. Again, the number is 202-521-1320. Taking 2 calls on the line straight after this, but you can be next. Again, we'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the critical hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're taking calls this segment. 202-521-1320 is the number. That's the number to call. Again, 202-521-1320. Tarif in New Orleans. Tarif, thanks for calling in. How are you doing this morning, and what's on your mind?
I have to get me an alarm clock. I have, man. But anyway, good morning, gentlemen. I have this link I'm going to tie to y'all tweet today. Ex-Victoria's Secret CEO Lex Wexner tries to dodge legal fight between Alan Dershowitz and Jeffrey Epstein. There's something dealing with a deposition, you know. They're trying to get him to testify or give a deposition. He's trying to avoid it. So I'm gonna put that link up to your tweet today. The mail-in ballot, I'm concerned about 5 or 6 weeks ago for the Louisiana primary. I saw 2 mail-in ballots came to my mother's house, who I live with currently now, and I didn't see mine. So I don't know if it got lost in the mail or I don't know what happened, but I'm not trying to accuse the state of Louisiana of anything, but I didn't see mine. So that kind of concerned me. I don't know if it's still sending mine or whatnot. I don't know what's going on with that. And that's my last comment is Trump got to explain himself dealing with that tax cut. She called that payroll tax cut, because that will affect Social Security. And he said if he win again, I want him to win again, but he said if he win again, that he's going to cut it out altogether. So he got to explain to people about, you know, where you get the money for pay for Social Security and Medicaid from somewhere else. So he has to explain himself. And news reporters have to ask him that, you know.
Tarif, what Trump won't do is explain himself on Social Security. He's not going to explain that they're taking away and making Social Security unstable by pulling the money directly from the donations that people have to give to Social Security. I guarantee you that it's not something he's going to explain. If anything, he's going to argue, hey, there's nothing wrong with it. I'm not destabilizing it. The money is just going to be taken from the general fund. That's going to be his argument. He's not going to go into this notion that this is undermining the Social Security and the Medicare systems and basically putting a funding hole in those systems with this quote-unquote payroll nonsense. And by the way, his own Republican Party can go for it.
I think he might. I mean, we'll see. It might come to an explanation. This is one of those cases where we're just going to have to see how this rolls out. Because again, the executive order and the sort of promise to roll back the stuff, to cancel those taxes on employees in general if he gets reelected, that's all sort of pending in a deep way. But when it goes forward, the thing is if Social Security, if Medicare, if that stuff gets imperiled, then there's going to be a huge amount of pushback. And so in some sense, I believe he would explain himself, but in some sense he would have to when everything comes onto the table and when the specifics of this start to roll out. I think that's going to be a necessity.
But wouldn't that have been true for COVID-19 also? When you have 160-some thousand people dead and Trump is presented with this number saying, why did you fail so bad? His response hasn't been, I failed because of XYZ. His response is, I did everything right. We are doing awesome. The United States has been testing like nobody's business and basically not accepting any level of blame for this failure. I mean,
it depends
Trump
on the
would
tense.
do that across the board.
It depends on the tense. We're looking with COVID-19, we're looking back into the past. With this issue, you'd be looking forward to it in the future. You'd be looking at the specifics of it again if he gets reelected. And it's not just a deferral or a forgiveness of this one period, which might be justified. But if it's a general tax cut, if it's getting rid of that, that's going to become a major issue. And I don't see how he would avoid that.
But it's a deferral. I mean, I don't know how Trump avoids. Like, I guess I'm saying, if you're looking back at
I was responding more to the tax cut part where we were talking about him getting reelected. The deferral is another thing. And this will destabilize it for this year. But then you also have potentially huge amounts of money getting printed out. So that, I mean, I could see there being a way to not put it directly on employees, but instead to pay for it out of some general fund that gets passed through a stimulus package to make it up.
It has been paid from the general fund before, but this is a Republican Party that salivates off of getting rid of Medicare and Social Security every bit as much as they salivate on getting rid of the Postal Service. If I can look back at Trump's previous behavior,
it's an election year though too, is another thing.
But if I can,
it's going to be an issue.
If I can look back at Trump's previous behavior and say that Trump behaved this way when you had this many people that were supposed to went to his inauguration, it was the greatest inauguration crowd ever, and it wasn't, and he lied about it. If I can go to COVID-19 and show that he continuously lies about it, if I can go from one issue to the next and show that Donald Trump's response is basically to ignore reality, then there's no reason for me to believe, looking forward, that Donald Trump would do anything different with this issue with Social Security. I mean, I don't know why I'm supposed to give Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt if over and over again he's shown he doesn't deserve it.
We'll see. Well, it's going to be an iterated thing. Are you done to go to the next call?
Yeah. Let's go to the caller. We have Robert in DC.
What's going on, guys? It's good to hear from you again. But I'm a Biden guy, and you guys took our past guest took it right up to the limit when he said that over the 8 years that. And I'm against the mail-in ballot. If they could stand in line in Africa with machetes, I ain't scared of the COVID virus to cast my vote when I do get to cast it. What do you say about that, though?
But you realize that's you, Robert. Like, there are a lot of people who are infirmed, a lot of people who are not well, a lot of people who are not in either the best of health or is working with people who are not necessarily in good health, that have to have a certain responsibility that go above and beyond the responsibility of being in a machete-wielding line. In this country, do we have mechanisms to vote that go beyond this notion that the person has to stand in line to cast a ballot when their life or their health is at stake? I think that's obscene to basically make a comparison or argument saying, well, hey, in Africa, they have to stand in line. In some area in Africa, they have to stand in line where they have machete-wielding people driving around in limos with no ceilings, threatening them, versus America and a virus. I don't think that's a standard that we even need to go with. That's somewhat of a straw man. The point is, and the question is, if there is a real concern about people potentially getting ill at the polling booth and the polling locations, can we come up with a different way of doing voting? I think this is the same argument or conversation about schools. I don't think we need to sacrifice one for the other. There will be some people who are brave to go to the polls like you, and there's nothing wrong with that. People need to make sure they have their protective equipment and everything else on. But for people who are concerned, for example, my grandmother, I wouldn't dare want her to go to the polling locations in her health. And my wife would probably say the same thing about me. So you do see some difference between a machete-wielding group in Africa threatening pollsters, or people who are working at the polls, versus going to polling in the United States where there is revenue and resources that can allow the election to take place in a more legal way. You do get that right, Robert?
The failures of the Postal Service on 3 years of Trump. Our last guest.
Oh, I'm not blaming that. Wait. Robert, you heard me in the conversation. Wait, Robert, in the conversation with Chuck, yes. I was very specific in bringing up why hasn't Obama or the Democrats do anything about it between 2006 to 2018 or 2016. Obama had the House, the Senate, and the presidency. Meaning, if Democrats cared about the Postal Service as any real measure beyond this kind of just nonsense now that they have to use this as a touch point for Trump, then they would have put their bodies on the line to protect it and to rehabilitate it right then and there once they took office. So you can't take the argument with me that I'm not bringing up Obama. I was the one that brought Obama into the conversation entirely.
The Bernie boy supported the things that you're back in 06. He said that. He said that back in 06.
What he said, what Chuck said. What Chuck said was that Sanders was the one that stopped Obama from putting the person in charge that would have wanted to get rid of the Postal Service back then. That's what he said. I can play it back to you. Literally, that Sanders was the vote to stop them under Obama from basically attacking and destroying the Postal Service. That's what he said. I was just talking to him 20 minutes ago.
I misread it, but I had to comment on it. It was too crazy. We can't blame everything on Mr. Orange.
And I didn't. And by the way, I didn't. That's my point. I didn't, Chuck. I guess my point, my ire in this, believe it or not, it's not at Republicans. I look at Republicans as being ideological actors in a reality space that doesn't have right and wrong associated with it. Meaning, if they decide in their heads it is in our best interest collectively to get rid of this organization and get rid of this institution that the public wants, even if the public wants it to the tune of like 90%, doesn't matter. We don't want it. We want our cronies and people of our class to be able to take advantage of all that cash. We want to ensure that those workers aren't making a living wage, that the services that these guys are delivering is somehow cut in some way. We want those things. Now, I look at that as being obscene. And I look at that as saying, what's in the best interest of the American public is the Postal Service. Low cost, does its job efficiently, and is what government does when it's doing a good job. I wanted to make the point, however, that the Democratic Party does not fundamentally believe that. 75% of their time is spent begging for money in the same way that the Republicans are. So I don't blame this on Trump per se. I look at these guys as ideological actors. I have more ire against Democrats on this because they are saying one thing while behind the scenes doing something else. Because if you wanted to protect and preserve the Postal Service, you could have done so when you had absolute power in the political space. They didn't. So that wasn't their main concerns. I guess my point is, Robert.
And one thing here, real quick.
Go ahead, Shane.
Well, Bernie Sanders, on the topic of Bernie Sanders, we've got another caller we should go to before we're too late into the segment. But with Bernie Sanders, back in February of 2013, he and Rep. Peter DeFazio introduced legislation that was going to repeal that 2006 law. So he was actually, maybe there's something that I'm missing about the state of the original bill, but in 2013, he was one of the only people who was pushing this thing, co-sponsored by a number of other people, including Kirsten Gillibrand, also co-sponsored by Al Franken back in the day, Ron Wyden too. So I mean, a few others on there, but he was one of the two who introduced it. So yeah, his stance on that is pretty clear. But if you're down, let's go to Joe in Pennsylvania.
Take that, Robert. I'm sorry. I'm teasing. Let's go to Joe. Joe in Pennsylvania. What's going on?
Yes, sir. No, I was going to actually two comments, or actually a comment and a question. The thing about the Postal Service, I remember that goes back all the way to Ronald Reagan. They've been attacking that.
Yes, it does.
It is based on ideology. But the question I had was, that first guest brought up the term PRILS, P-R-I-L-L-S, and she was talking about the ammonium nitrate there in Beirut. And
she was.
My understanding is that the substance itself, it's not flammable. It has to be mixed with fuel oil or some kind of a fuel to make that kind of an explosion. So that's why I'm inclined to believe her that it was an attack. I think they were probably attacking Hezbollah's weapons or something like that, and they didn't expect, if ammunition was close to that, they didn't expect that kind of an explosion. And I think that explains why Israel did offer aid, which they never do unless it's one of their allies.
Yeah, that was shocking. That was really bizarre. I mean, because they came out almost immediately. Thank you for the call, Joe. I appreciate it. Look, I don't take the side whether or not I believe one side did it or not. I don't know. I mean, this is me, an investigation. And this is me even knowing that the investigation itself might not necessarily be truthful, considering that the government has just resigned in Lebanon. But I do accept her word for it that, yeah, this is strange. This is very strange. And their behavior on this has been very bizarre. What do you think about it, Shane?
It has been, yeah. I mean, one quick note, just to sort of, I don't know if it's a correction exactly, because I might have misheard you. But Joe, I think you said something about how it wasn't flammable on itself. I believe you were talking about the ammonium nitrate. The thing was, there was a fire going on next door. There were these two warehouses. It seems like there was one much larger one with a bunch of firecrackers, fireworks in it, and then there was a smaller warehouse right next door with the ammonium nitrate. And the firecrackers, according to the official narrative right now, firecrackers caught fire first, and then eventually, as that fire grew, the ammonium nitrate acted as a catalyst, basically acted as a sort of accelerant, bringing a lot of more oxygen into that fire. And so there was some sort of thing there. The thing that Maram was saying, though, is just that the amount of force produced, very visibly produced in videos, but just produced, that they were measuring, wasn't proportional to the amount of acceleration brought by the ammonium nitrate. Ammonium nitrate, in conjunction with those firecrackers, from what she was saying, shouldn't have been enough to create that size explosion. I just want to briefly, we've got to go into a break. I want to re-clarify something I was saying earlier. I brought up something about the membrane, and it was a little bit confusing of the building. Really what I was thinking is something like whether the warehouse as a container acted almost like the bomb, a bomb casing does for the explosives inside of a bomb, where it sort of contains the explosion and then concentrates it into a single point. and how that may have contributed. I don't know. I'm just looking for ways to wrap my mind around this from the official narrative, but we should go into a break. Thank you for the call, Joe. We'll be back in a minute with Caleb Maupin. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. That's myself. We're joined for this segment and the next segment by Caleb Maupin. He is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and an author, specifically of the book City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, articles and essays on socialism. By the way, you can follow Caleb on Twitter at Caleb Maupin, CalebMaupin. You can also read his articles at calebmaupin.com, spelled the exact same way. Caleb, thanks for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Great. How about yourself?
Good. So we're talking about a lot of stuff here. Talking about the COVID eviction crisis, the rental crisis potentially, also the wider economic crisis and Trump's executive orders this weekend. That's probably this first segment, and then I think we're next segment getting into the U.S.-China relationship, recent conflicts, recent sanctions. This weekend, the back and forth, where the U.S. imposed sanctions on Carrie Lam, Hong Kong's governor, also on 10 other officials. And then I believe it was Sunday that there was a tit for tat. No, I believe it would have been Monday, actually. Yesterday that there was a tit for tat where Hong Kong, China retaliated and sanctioned U.S. officials and politicians. Anyway, we can get into that then, but just foreshadowing that slightly. Coming back to the coronavirus and the eviction crisis coming up, what did you think of Trump's executive orders this weekend? Maybe just for starters, where do you see those going? What do you think the prospects are for those? What's your personal opinion on their content? And maybe we can start there. Caleb?
Well, let me just say that Donald Trump presents himself as a populist. He says he's, fighting for average Americans. He's standing up to the rich and powerful and the elite. But his image as a populist does not line up with free market economic policies. His economic policies have been policies of deregulation, of lowering taxes on the rich and powerful. He pushed the idea that he was going to build infrastructure, and that completely flopped. That turned into nothing, despite the fact that the United States, infrastructure-wise, is very much suffering. And that this is the fundamental problem facing the Trump administration, is that as much as they might talk a game that they're fighting for the common people and all of that, it seems that all populism really means to them is anti-immigrant bigotry, is kind of stoking resentment against protesters and trying to, pull a page from Richard Nixon and his silent majority rhetoric from the late 1960s, early 70s. It seems that, if Trump wants to fight for average Americans, he should be trying to figure out how to get them what they need in this pandemic. They're not completely getting rid of the unemployment enhancement, but it's going down by a third, from $600 to $400. That's going to take food out of the mouths of children all across the United States. People are suffering, and yet, there's all this talk of bailing out Wall Street once again, spending more money on military confrontation. There's even a proposal that's most likely going to go through for $139 million to combat so-called disinformation from Russia at a time when people all across this country are suffering. You talk about the eviction, the eviction situation and how that not only is that going to result in all kinds of people losing their homes, an increase in homelessness around the country, which is the last thing we need during a pandemic. But on top of that, it's going to cause the housing markets to spiral downward. And the housing costs are going to decrease. People are already leaving the cities. New York City, we're seeing all the wealthy people, all the the wealthy folks that kind of make this a big tourist center are fleeing the city and leaving. I mean, this is all heading toward an economic catastrophe. Donald Trump likes to present himself as if he's fighting for the average Americans. He's going to drain the swamp. I'm not seeing it. I look at those policies. I am not seeing it.
I'm curious, from your standpoint, Caleb, what would a socialist government have done differently? Let's not even call it socialist in purity. Let's say a Sanders government, for example. Let's say Sanders was in office and this took place. How do you think he would have handled this differently, or somebody with that frame of mind or framing of the world, the workable point of view? How would they have handled this differently as opposed to the way that Trump handled this virus now? And what do you think the outcome would have been from handling it in that different way?
Well, first of all, I can't speak to what Sanders personally would have done, but I would think that a government that was prioritizing average Americans in this situation, one of the first things they would have done is there would have been testing available widely, immediately, and for free. And the fact that months into this, people were still being charged outrageous costs for tests, the fact that tests were not widely available at first, and that even if you were willing to pay the cost of a test, it was hard to get one. That was a mistaken policy. There should have been tests everywhere. And on top of that, there should have been health care immediately available. There should have been, emergency hospitals being constructed, like what was done in China. On top of that, the unemployed need to be immediately hired. I would say we need a new works progress administration. There's so much work that needs to be done in terms of the infrastructure of the country, with roads crumbling, with water facilities not properly treating our water, with power plants that are in shambles. There's plenty of work to be done all throughout this country. There's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Caleb, are you still there?
I'm still here, yes. And there's all throughout the United States, there's plenty of work that needs to be done. And when you have millions of people unemployed like we have now, they need to be hired. They should hire the unemployed. A new works progress administration would get to work fixing up the country, and not only addressing the fact that there are millions of people unemployed, get them spending, get them working, get them building the infrastructure that's the center of a productive economy. But on top of that, it would address public health as well, because health and the spread of disease, all of that has a lot to do with unclean environments, without things that are sanitary, with crumbling and improperly treated facilities and such. So there's plenty of work that needs to be done, and I think that a government that would prioritize average Americans would immediately swing into action, hiring people, constructing, and also making sure that testing is available, making sure that healthcare facilities are there and such.
Joe Biden is not going to do that. And because Joe Biden is not going to do that, you have this situation where people, even in the election year, despite all of these things going on, and like you said, I agree with your prognosis, or the prescription, I should say, in regards to, at the very least, trying to deal with it or trying to address it in any real rational terms, if rationality is tethered to what's in the best interest of human health. Joe Biden is not going to be that guy. He's already said that basically things aren't going to change if he gets in office. How does this, does this pick up steam in regards to people not accepting or not being happy with their political device, believing the politics of our time is not necessarily delivering the things that the public needs? So what happens when Biden gets in office? Does the public just go back to sleep? Or do you believe that there's actually a larger groundswell that develops into some kind of movement that actually does push for those items that you're talking about?
Well, I'm quite nervous about the situation with Joe Biden. If you look at the situation with Joe Biden, he is, the Democratic nominee. But who will be his vice presidential candidate? Who will be his VP? Now, at this point, some people are saying it is definitely going to be Kamala Harris. But it appears that, we're still waiting for him to make that announcement. And Kamala Harris was the Hillary Clinton candidate. The backers of Hillary Clinton had backed Kamala Harris. That is no secret whatsoever. And that she is very much seen as a continuation of the Hillary Clinton State Department from the Obama administration. She is very much somebody who believes in regime change, chaos, and instability around the world. And that it seems also that she's someone who kind of, in my view, lacks a moral compass. I mean, if you look at her record as a prosecutor, trying to keep innocent people on death row, you talk about the fact that she put well over 1,000 people in prison and gave them criminal records for smoking marijuana, and then laughs in radio interviews about the fact that she also smoked marijuana. She's a very scary candidate in my view. But it seemed like so much of the establishment has kind of picked her and even wanted her to be even the nominee, not the vice president. But the fact that Joe Biden has not yet named his vice presidential candidate is very interesting. And I think that behind the scenes, there's a bit of a power struggle. I think there are a lot of forces that really want Kamala Harris, but there are a lot of forces that are very, very afraid of Kamala Harris. When Tulsi Gabbard got up at the debates and used her very, very limited time in the debates to go after Kamala Harris, she spoke for a wider milieu than just herself. There's a reason she went after one particular candidate. And I think that behind the scenes, there are many people that realize that Kamala Harris and her faction, that same faction that ran the Hillary Clinton State Department, is very, very dangerous. Barack Obama was asked about the best and worst moments of his presidency. He said the worst thing about his presidency was Libya, how he, overthrew the Libyan government and they didn't have a clear plan for the country. He said the best moment was 2013 when he managed to not directly attack the Syrian government. Well, his best moment was a moment where he stood up to Hillary Clinton and didn't attack Syria. His worst moment was when he attacked Libya, something that Hillary Clinton pushed him to do. Even within the Obama-Biden administration, there was an understanding that the Hillary Clinton State Department, Anne-Marie Slaughter, Samantha Power, Cass Sunstein, these people are dangerous. They are hell-bent on regime change. And Biden, I think, understood that. Obama replaced Hillary Clinton with John Kerry, who focused on negotiating with Cuba, negotiating the Iran deal. And I think that within the centrist Democrat milieu, even within there is an understanding of how dangerous Kamala Harris really is. And I think that now in the back room, there is a negotiation going on because the forces that want Kamala Harris are quite powerful, but the forces that want to stop her are quite powerful as well. And I think I wish we could be in the back room finding out, these last minute negotiations, because I'm not sure if we're going to get Kamala Harris or not. But if we do, the stakes are very, very high.
What do you think of, so Willie Brown, San Francisco's first black mayor, recently came out and said that he didn't think Kamala Harris should be the VP pick. He thought she should be the AG pick. This would kind of be the Attorney General for the U.S. if she was put in a Biden administration. This would kind of make a little bit more sense for her. I mean, she was not just the district attorney for San Francisco, but of course also the Attorney General for California. What would you think of that? Is that more frightening for you? What's your take on that prospect, Caleb?
I mean, her record as a prosecutor is pretty awful. It's a pretty awful record. Kamala Harris is a frightening figure as well. I mean, on my YouTube channel, I interviewed somebody who was a Palestine activist in San Francisco. And after Kamala Harris, when she was, a local prosecutor in San Francisco, she was invited to go to Israel. And so then she agreed to meet with Palestine activists in San Francisco. And, she'd spent several days in Israel, going around hearing the Israeli perspective. So she gave these Palestine activists less than a half hour. And, they walked in, they started talking with her, and she didn't reply to anything they said. She didn't ask them any questions. It was simply a kind gesture that she even had them come to her office. And you can look at some of the clips of Kamala Harris making fun of protesters. Right now, she wants to present herself as if she is a protester, right? But earlier, we've seen her, mocking protesters, and she has this kind of laugh, and she's saying, build more schools, less jails, and she's making fun of leftists and protesters. It's very scary,
So I see what you're saying. We've got to go into a break, but you're pretty cautious of her policies, both foreign and domestic, and especially as they would be applied in that position as an AG. We'll be back in a minute. We're joined by Caleb Maupin. Be back with him in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Breaking news, expert analysis, and exclusive stories, all in one place. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Tune in every Wednesday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker and John Kiriakou for a regular segment called Beyond Nuclear, where Brian and John discuss nuclear issues, including weapons, energy, waste, and the future of nuclear technology in the United States, with Kevin Camps, the radioactive waste watchdog at the organization Beyond Nuclear. Listen on Wednesdays right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Shane Stranahan. Joining us is Caleb Maupin, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author of The City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, articles and essays on socialism. Caleb, again, thank you for joining us. I want to move slightly to what has been taking place from the standpoint of America's law, China's national security law. And one of the people that was locked up over this was a gentleman named Jimmy Lai. Now, Lai is rich, was in Hong Kong, and was using his resources that dimension, clear picture or clear signs that he was working with the United States, and basically helping people who were quote unquote pro-democracy, knife-wielding, bomb-setting protesters. Well, Jimmy Lai has just been arrested, and China has done a tit for tat in basically putting sanctions on people like Marco Rubio, or for that matter, Ted Cruz, in addition to a few other U.S. legislatures. This is an escalation, clearly, with the tit-for-tat kind of project. But Jimmy Lai actually was working to undermine China in Hong Kong, correct? I mean, this is not just an arrest just to arrest somebody in these kind of political terms. I mean, he was working in the interests of the U.S., or maybe even of his own. You could say that the politics dovetailed in this case. But I do think it's clear that he was, and as such, he was arrested because of such. Am I insane in this? Am I presenting this incorrectly, or am I getting something in this wrong?
No, I think you've got it exactly right. I mean, this is somebody who is rich and powerful in Hong Kong and was using his millions and billions to foment unrest, working with the United States to do it. And this points to the real facts about the Hong Kong protesters that nobody really wants to talk about. People want to describe this as just simply a struggle for democracy, et cetera. Look at what the issue is. The issue is the extradition law. And the extradition law basically is an arrangement where people that are rich and powerful in Hong Kong, business owners in Hong Kong, can go to the Chinese mainland, break the law on the Chinese mainland, and not be held accountable for it in the courts of the Chinese mainland, right? There's a lot of business owners and wealthy folks in Hong Kong who do business on the Chinese mainland. And right now they have this special arrangement where they will never be held accountable in the courts of the Chinese mainland. This would be like, Iowa having a special arrangement where people from Iowa could go to Washington, D.C. or go to New York City, break the law, and then, they handle it in Iowa. Well, no other country would tolerate that. If you break the law in New York, you're going to go to court in New York. You break the law in Washington, D.C., you're going to go to court in Washington, D.C. But Hong Kong has this special arrangement that is very convenient for a lot of wealthy business owners, that they can do business on the Chinese mainland. They can perhaps be involved in corruption and bribery. Perhaps they can break the law, and that they have these courts in Hong Kong that are much more favorable to them. Let's keep in mind that the Hong Kong political system is much more favorable toward wealthy people from Hong Kong, and they can be held accountable in their own courts in Hong Kong. That's the whole basis of the protest. It is about the extradition law. It is about protecting rich and powerful people in Hong Kong from being accountable under the laws of the Chinese mainland. That's the issue. It's about keeping rich people like this individual you named from being held accountable under Chinese law. It's about protecting the 1% from the court system on the Chinese mainland. Now, of course, there's problems. I'm not going to say the court system on the Chinese mainland is perfect, right? I mean, there's many examples of corruption. There's many examples of cases that people can bring up. But there's also criticism of the Hong Kong, court system as well. And I think this is simply a matter of, is Hong Kong really part of China, which it is,
right.
Or are we going to make Hong Kong kind of an outpost of Western business interests?
I love the way you put that. Yeah. No,
yeah,
Shane,
no,
go for it.
That makes sense. That as background for the extradition crisis in Hong Kong, which again really sparked these protests, like you were saying, sparked the U.S. support specifically. One aspect of this, so that's extradition. This weekend, like we were talking about, there were these new sanctions put into place. Sanctions obviously have become, as far as I can tell, the main vehicle for diplomatic conflict. And it seems like they're not just nominal. It's not just an optical thing where it's, again, there was an optical aspect to this. The United States sanctioned 11 officials in Hong Kong and China, and they did the exact same number of officials. They sanctioned the exact same number of officials back. So there's a part of this that's reciprocal. It's tit for tat. It's just a continuation of this politics as war by other means. But another question here, what are the actual practical and sort of material impacts of those sanctions? So is the significance just optical? Is it that there are investors, potentially people with influence who might be getting locked out? What do you see as the actual impact of these sanctions, Caleb?
Well, the ultimate impact of them, I must say, is going to be more division in the world economy. And increasingly, we're seeing a Chinese and Russian sphere of influence and an American sphere of influence. And basically, entities and individuals are being, told, well, you can trade with Russia and China, or you can trade with the United States. That's not good. That's not good for the world economy. There are a lot of developing countries who'd like to trade with both and feel like they could benefit from trading with both. But the more sanctions that are imposed, when you pick out entities like Huawei technology, or you pick out pipelines like Nord Stream 2 coming out of Russia, and you make them toxic under U.S. sanctions. If you do business with Nord Stream 2, if you do business with Huawei technologies, you can't have anything to do with the United States. When you do that, you are basically creating a dichotomy where, the U.S. economy is isolated from the world. The Russian and Chinese economy is then isolated, and you have two spheres of influence. You have to pick one. Well, the thing is, this could bounce back to hurt U.S. leaders, because you'll notice that the Russian and Chinese economies have picked up since COVID-19. China got COVID-19 before anybody. They had no warning. But yet their economy is starting to move ahead already. Their shipping numbers are up. They're recovering from this. Meanwhile, the United States, we're in free fall here. The housing market is about to crash. Unemployment numbers are through the roof. We're having an election that's looked like it's going to be followed by instability, no matter who wins, because both sides are preparing not to accept it seems. And we're not in a good situation here. So if we're going to tell the world, you either trade with us or you trade with Russia and China, we may actually regret it. It may be that a number of countries see China's economy start moving, see Russia's economy start moving, see Vietnam doing well, and they say, okay, well, I guess we'll trade with the other one. And this is not good. We should have win-win cooperation in global trade. We should have a situation where the whole world trades with the whole world, and countries don't go to war because it is in their economic interest to have good relations and trade with each other and build each other up based on win-win cooperation. This is not an ideal situation at all. This sanctions game, the U.S. wages economic warfare. That's what sanctions really are, is it's economic warfare. And it's not a good thing to do at all. It's not good for the world. And I think at the end of the day, it could bounce back to hurt the United States more than anything.
Well, that's the interesting thing here. It's not just a statement of indictment. It's not just words. It's not just public announcements and declarations, pardon me, coming out from each of these governments. It's individualized sanctions levied against individuals. And you could see, for instance, the closing out of entire classes of investors or banks or businesses. I mean, a lot of this seems to be leading up to that just grand dissolution of the last 30 to 70 years, however long you want to put it, of at least nominally free trade and free flows of investment, which would be a sort of pivotal moment and arguably the zenith of a certain kind of world order and a certain kind even of capitalism. A conversation maybe we can continue at some other point. Obviously, we've had that conversation plenty before on air. What I actually want to turn to, though, in our last couple of minutes, you brought up something earlier that reminded me of this. I think you used the word populism, actually. I think you specifically distinguished populism from this sort of what a lot of people would think of as populism, which is ethnic nationalism filled with sort of racial resentment and a lot of the sort of uglier things that I think are used to bring down nationalism as well. That's a kind of another conversation, but there's this continuum of policies largely based on views of the Nazis, all this stuff. Anyway, the last 50 years, 70 years, 100 years, arguably even, has been largely tainted, I think, by this discreditation of local political organization and local political movement, which I think populism in its best form takes. Anyway, what I want to get to you about, I know we've talked about this a bit before. You've been getting into some arguments with people who've specifically been criticizing left-wing populists in any attempt to reconcile a broader political base, whether it's on the left or on the right, into a wider populist movement. Could you just talk a bit about that and get into, if you had to sort of put what you see as a better kind of populism, an actual viable form of populism that would represent political interests in the modern American state and society, what would that look like to you? But also, what pushback have you been getting on trying to make those inroads? Caleb.
Well, populism originally was a left-wing movement. And, I mean, populism in the United States was the roots of the term. It comes out of Abraham Lincoln. And, you know, when Abraham Lincoln formed a big coalition that involved labor unions, small farmers, to defeat slavery, as, you know, coming out of the Civil War, as the Republican Party moved into becoming more of an imperialist and big banker party, the small farmers and the labor unionists, they formed the People's Party that was known as the Populists, and they called for the nationalization of railroads. They called for a silver standard as opposed to the gold standard, and it was kind of a mass movement of people who wanted to continue the revolutionary side of the Republican Party. And at first, it was anti-racist. Now, over the course of a few decades, you know, racist voices within the populist movement gained a lot of traction, and eventually the racist populists went into the Democratic Party. And that's the history of populism in the United States. And that, you know, populism, what does it mean? It means fighting for the people against the elites. And populism was considered to be left-wing, and socialism is probably the most widespread form of populism in the world. The idea that the banks, factories, and industries should be made to serve the people, the means of production should be organized to serve society as a whole. That's a pretty populist concept. Unfortunately, you go up into the 1930s, the right wing, started to co-opt populist, ideas with the rise of fascism and such. And then, post-World War II, you started to have, in the Western countries, because there was so much prosperity, the left start to divorce itself from populism. And the left start to emphasize individual alienation, the rise of the Frankfurt School, Herbert Marcuse, and voices like that really argued that being a leftist was about, freedom for the intellectual and such. So populism has always been left-wing, but because of the weird confusion that came following the Second World War in the Western countries, now there's this belief that somehow leftism is not about populism, it's about individualism, and populism is inherently right-wing or racist or fascist. The reality is, though, if you look at the strength of socialist movements around the world, when you go to the history in the United States or around the developing world, they're populist movements. They're fighting for average people, they're controlling the economy, and that the left, when it is strong and powerful, is the voice of the people. And when the left is weak, when the left is isolated, it's the voice of alienated intellectuals who who kind of are protesting against society and want their individualism. So,
It sadly seems like we're there now. It also seems silent. We've got to cut it here. Thank you for joining us, Caleb. Really appreciate it. That was the voice of Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author of City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, articles and essays on socialism. You can follow him on Twitter at Caleb Maupin and read his articles at calebmaupin.com. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks to Engineer Andre. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, I want to thank all of you for joining us once again. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I forgot to put the insignia up. Right, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Today was Shane's birthday. And so Shane came on, did the job on his birthday. I will see you guys probably a little bit later today. In fact, I definitely will see you guys at least for a couple of shows after this one. Like, share, and of course, as always, subscribe.